Systems innovation and systems change are terms that have risen to prominence in the past few decades in the face of a new set of challenges that are recognized to be complex, interconnected, and highly dynamic. Around the world, societies face complex challenges as we find ourselves in a time of transformation. As advanced economies move out of an industrial mode, we see public institutions in crisis, our most critical systems in various stages of stalling, while the environmental challenge to build a sustainable future appears to grow ever greater and more pressing. At the same time, society's problem-solving capacities are at a record high. People are more informed and educated. There is more capital floating around than ever before. At the same time, many people want to be engaged in creating a different world, and technology is enabling society to perform large collaborative tasks more effectively and at ever lower cost. With the rise of globalization, information technology, and an unfolding environmental crisis, the world has changed in quite radical ways in the past decades alone. As a consequence, we are challenged to evolve new organizational structures and capabilities that are currently significantly absent. After decades of living in this new globalized world, a failure to gain traction on even one of the global challenges today is a testimony to a failing set of approaches. Current responses to our most pressing societal challenges, from poverty and inequality to ethnic conflict and climate change, appear not to be working. These problems are incredibly dynamic and complex, constituting an ever-evolving array of technologies, actors, and circumstances. Yet we address them through traditional centralized bureaucratic processes of long-term planning based upon fixed future projections. Many of today's strategic challenges, from security and terrorism to migration and water scarcity, can be better thought of as complex adaptive systems, continuously recreated through the ongoing choices, actions, and interactions among numerous players operating across dense global networks. Such systemic phenomena require a whole new strategic toolbox if we are to have any real impact in shaping the world we live in. There is growing awareness that these systems are in fact fundamentally complex and thus require a different approach. They demand a more holistic, networked, emergent, and evolutionary approach. Building on complexity theory's deep knowledge of dynamic systems, systems innovation presents an alternative to our traditional centralized approaches. Systems innovation is a new systems-based approach to enabling change within complex organizations. It is a holistic approach that looks at the underlying dynamics and root causes of the issue, working with the innate evolutionary potential of complex adaptive systems to enable transformative change in their structure, behavior, and functional capabilities. This course is an overview of the current state of systems innovation and systems change. It draws upon the work of prominent systems thinkers such as Donella Meadows and Russell Ackoff, along with the insights from contemporary researchers and social entrepreneurs, to give an overview of the current state of systems innovation. The course should be of relevance to anyone interested in transformative change within large, complex organizations.
The term systems innovation has become popular in the past decades, but the term is often left as somewhat vague, so let's start by presenting a working definition. Systems innovation can be understood as a combination of systems thinking and the process of innovation so as to enable transformative change within a complex system. So there are three primary aspects here: systems thinking, innovation, and complex systems. Systems thinking is a way of looking at the world. It is what we call a holistic paradigm, meaning that it enables us to look at, analyze, and talk about whole systems rather than simply looking at their parts. According to the Oxford Dictionary, innovation is to make changes in something established, especially by introducing new methods, ideas, or products. A complex system is typically a large-scale system composed of many interdependent parts that are relatively autonomous. All of the large-scale systems we are interested in our economy, are complex adaptive systems, food systems, energy systems, political systems, health systems, financial systems, etc. So, systems innovation is about using systems thinking to enable transformative change within these complex organizations. In this section, we will elaborate on each aspect of this so as to get a high-level overview for what we mean by this term systems innovation. Firstly, what is innovation? Innovation is about the creation of something that is both new and of value. However, it is also about its adoption and implementation so as to change some established way of doing things. The key aspects of innovation are that of creativity and change. However, innovation is different from pure creativity in that it is looking at both ends of the equation, both the creation of something new and useful, but also its adoption and usage within society so as to enable real change in the world around us. According to Stephen Shapiro, innovation is simply staying relevant. This is an important aspect of innovation, whereas pure creativity is often about things that exist in the abstract. They are somewhat timeless and come from within, so to speak, like a painting or a piece of classical music. However, innovation is about responding to the environment. It is seeing how the world is changing and building something that will be relevant for that world of tomorrow. It is really what enables us to adapt to the changing environment. It is the introduction of a new solution that adds value because it fits with the overall context within which it is introduced. That is why adoption is important. If it is not adopted, that is because it does not fit with the current context and deliver value. Thus, it may be creative, but it is not really innovation because it has not actually changed anything. Typically, when we talk about innovation, we think of things. Some kind of a technology, like a mobile phone, an electric bike, an app, or some other new product. We have got really good at creating, designing, and redesigning things. After many centuries of perfecting our industrial model, we have created a lot of things. Indeed, we might say we have created too many things. This type of innovation is focused on parts. Building a better car, which is just one part in the transport system. Making a better solar panel, which is just one part in an energy system. Creating a better medical device, which is one part in the health system. Whereas much of our traditional thinking is focused on parts and closed forms of incremental innovation, many of the challenges we face today require a different form of change. A different form of innovation, a form of innovation that changes systems, not just parts. The world is changing in profound ways as we move from the industrial age into an age of information, globalization, and sustainability. As our industrial age systems of organization come to the end of their life cycle, we find ourselves increasingly challenged with building whole new networked systems. The real design challenges are shifting from building things to building systems. Not another house, but designing a whole smart city. Not another power plant, but a whole smart grid. Not another car, but an integrated transport service. As the social innovator Indy Johar puts it, whilst it's cute and nice and relevant to be talking about the lovely nice things, underneath those nice things are a bunch of institutions and institutional behaviors that structure how we make our world. And to innovate, we're going to have to innovate those. What is missing today are organizations and systems that work. We have no shortage of thousands of different drugs, but we don't seem to be able to build health systems that really work the way they should. We're very good at building cars with the latest technology and fuel efficiency, but we don't seem to be able to build a transport system that works for all, including the environment. As billions of more people join the global economy from emerging markets, we find ourselves in a world of more and more people who want more and more things, and that equation is no longer adding up. What we really need is to organize those things better. We need to build systems, and this takes systems-level innovation, which is something we are not used to. We all have an idea for what innovation is, but what is innovation when you are dealing with a complex system? What does innovation look like when applied to redesigning how a whole political system works, or the public administration for millions of people and thousands of departments and subdepartments? This is not just a change in scale, it is also a change in quality. It requires a different kind of thinking and innovation. It is not something we are accustomed to. However, it is a form of innovation that we have to learn to do if we as enterprises, as governments, as open societies are going to survive in a complex, integrated global economy. Systems thinking looks at the world in terms of connections, patterns of organization, and how the system behavior emerges out of those patterns. Systems innovation is different because it is innovation not in things but in connections and organization. It is aimed at changing the basic structure of an organization. We are not trying to change the parts. Everything that we do in systems innovation will be about changing connections so as to realize a different form of emergent behavior and functionality within the system. This is about whole systems. We are very used to thinking of innovation as only applying to things, a self-driving car, an app, a new drone, etc. But imagine building new economies. We can actually do that today. Imagine building an economy based upon a full cost accounting system, one that does not just account for financial capital, but one that accounts for social capital and natural capital as well. That would incentivize radically different behavior. This is innovation in the institutional systems that structure human activity, and we can now do this thanks to technological developments. This kind of innovation doesn't grow your economy by an extra 1 or 2%. It actually rewrites the rules of what an economy is. These are the kind of quantum leaps that are needed today if we want to keep pace and remain relevant, given the massive upheavals taking place in our world today. We are in a period of transition comparable only to that of the agrarian revolution or the move into the modern era. Staying relevant within such a transformation will require innovation on a scale and depth to match that. As Jack Welch, the former CEO of General Electricity, put it succinctly, if the rate of change outside exceeds the rate of change inside, the end is in sight. Whereas management is generally about doing what we did in the past, the point of innovation is change, to not do what you are doing again. In a paper entitled Systems Change, What It Is and How to Do It, the authors write, systems change is an intentional process designed to alter the status quo by shifting the function or structure of the identified system with purposeful interventions. It is a journey which can require a radical change in people's attitudes as well as in the ways that people work. Systems innovators aim to transform the system in which they operate so as to no longer have a job, as there is no longer a problem to fix. As Ashoka's founder, Bill Drayton, once said, social entrepreneurs are not content to give a fish or teach how to fish. They will not rest until they have revolutionized the fishing industry. This helps to illustrate the expansive nature of systems innovation. Systems thinking itself is holistic. Holistic approaches always refer to the whole. This makes systems thinking expansive in nature. We're always reasoning upwards, and thus expanding our frame of reference. Likewise, doing systems innovation is the same. We're always looking upwards to the whole system we are a part of. We're always looking to see how our sphere of interest fits into the broader systems. For example, rather than support a person who is building a school, we search for people who are transforming the way children learn at a regional, national, or even international level. The ultimate frame of reference for all of this is the whole, complex global economy that we now find ourselves a part of. This is relevant because as the world becomes more interconnected and thus interdependent, a narrow focus on innovation improvements within a specific area can easily get overridden by broader processes of change. At first glance, it may appear like we are able to do all sorts of things with our large organizations and all this capital we have now accumulated. But the reality is that the connectivity and complexity have happened so fast, and our institutional paradigm is so not designed for it, that we are actually able to do quite little except for perpetuating what we did in the past. The analogy of a rabbit being caught in the headlights is not too far removed from where we find ourselves today. We quite simply do not have the institutional structures to operate in this kind of complex, networked global environment with the kind of challenges it creates. What we do have is hugely inefficient and thus ineffective given the new context. It is sobering to remember that we have not yet solved even one of the existing global issues, from climate change to cybersecurity to a refugee crisis to financial instability to soil erosion, and none of them are getting any better. But today, we have a powerful new set of technologies with which to build new organizational structures. In the past decades, we have put powerful tools for computation in the hands of many and interconnected us all with telecommunications networks. This offers the potential to innovate in virtually all spheres of human activity, to rethink virtually all of these systems as we turn the centralized organizations of today into the open networks of tomorrow. But doing that successfully requires new ways of thinking and systems innovation, the workings of which we will be exploring during this course. The aim of systems innovation is to change systems. So what is systems change? Systems change is about enabling transformation in the structure and interrelationships of the parts within a complex organization, so as to realize the emergence of new behavior and functionality required for that organization to operate successfully within its environment. To quote Forum for the Future, systemic change is where relationships between different aspects of the system have changed towards new outcomes and goals, and it's driven by transformational, not incremental change. Rachel Wharton and Alice Evans, in their article on the subject, define it in similar terms. Systems change is about addressing the root causes of social problems, which are often intractable and embedded in networks of cause and effect. It is an intentional process designed to fundamentally alter the components and structures that cause the system to behave in a certain way. The terms systems innovation and systems change have arisen in parallel to the idea of wicked problems, as a new language is now entering the public sphere, seeing problems as complex, interdependent, and involving high levels of uncertainty. Our old ways of thinking about problems as the product of simple cause and effect relations are subsiding in the face of a new set of challenges that governments, enterprises, and societies around the world are now facing. It is increasingly becoming recognized that problems like healthcare are not simple in their nature. We start to recognize that they involve many interrelated factors, such as our cultural and psychological attachment to poor quality foods, the economics and finance of food production and distribution, environmental issues such as air quality, issues to do with the built environment, not to mention impacts of social relations and advertising, all of which are no longer in the control of any one organization, but instead part of vast networks of actors that we call complex adaptive systems. These kinds of issues are now termed wicked problems, which are highly complex issues. They are unstructured, open-ended, they are multidimensional, systemic, and have no known solution. Examples of wicked problems include social discrimination and cultural segregation, climate change and environmental degradation, global financial instability and inequality, terrorism and cybersecurity. In all cases, the problem cannot be isolated and separated from the system. Because wicked problems are systemic in nature, they can be understood as an emergent phenomenon of how the local components interact, of how the system itself works, and not simply one part of the system that can be isolated, tackled, and solved in a traditional linear fashion. As a consequence, the only way to tackle these problems is to try and change the system, that is to say, to do system change. Systems thinking is about looking at the underlying dynamics within the system and how that creates the system's observable behavior. Systems change is about identifying and surfacing the core contradictions in the system, rather than the symptoms created by those contradictions. As an illustration of this, we can see financial institutions funding the Worldwide Fund for Nature, but they are often not interested in looking at the environmental impact of their investments. This is often the case. The underlying structure of the organization creates issues that it then spends its time and resources on patching over. What is different today is that the underlying structure of our industrial institutions is becoming so mismatched with the environment they operate in that it is ever more difficult to simply patch over them, and there is an increasing recognition for the need of systems change. These contradictions are what create the problems of today, but they are also the source of potential change in the system. Systems represent patterns of organization and self-reinforcing feedback loops that create the typical behavior of the system. For example, in a political system, we may see politicians saying one thing and then doing another. This is, however, not the product of some random accident or some maverick individual, but a product of the system's dynamics that creates a certain recurring pattern of behavior. It is part of the very way the system is organized. Initially, we may think it is a problem with the specific attributes of the individual in that position. But after seeing that if we swap out the individual and put in another, we get the same behavior, we will start to see that is the behavior of the system caused by its underlying dynamics. In such a case, altering any of the parts, for example, electing a new president, will not solve the issue. We have to understand the behavior of the system that is creating it and change the system in some way instead of just changing any of the parts. Whether analyzing difficult market conditions, water pollution within a community, extended social conflicts, or food security, the key to tackling such issues is understanding their underlying structures and complex patterns that help support them. Some well-known patterns of behaviors which frequently lead to undesirable outcomes in the systems are called archetypes. These archetypes include burden shifting or the tragedy of the commons and are studied in system dynamics, which we will look at in a later module. The complexity of systems often gives rise to suboptimal decision-making, when decisions are made by looking at a problem in isolation, instead of within the context of the whole system in which it is present. One example of such consequences in the food system is the impact of food aid. Despite its aim being the elimination of hunger, food aid is integrated into policies leading to structural food deficits and increased dependency on food imports. This kind of dependency, in union with the limited resources that developing economies have to finance their imports, may well actually lead to an increase in hunger and poverty. There is an important consequence that follows from this that Russell Ackoff states clearly when he says, "The critical point for contemporary management, it is the following. When you improve each part of the system taken separately, you do not improve the performance of the system taken as a whole, and are very likely to hurt it or decrease it, and that is completely counterintuitive." With our traditional analytical reductionist ways of thinking, if we see that there is something wrong with an organization, we believe that the failure must derive from one of the parts. The obvious consequences of this thinking is that we try to trace back the problems the system has to some specific component. Often, we ascribe systems-level dysfunctionality to a specific part in the system. If there's an issue in our healthcare system, our education system, or our political system, we try to trace the problem back to the medical staff, the lack of finance, the funding of campaigns, etc. We then try to fix that problem, but because system-level functionality and features are a product of the way the parts are interrelated, we do not solve the problem. As Russell Ackoff puts it, if you look at what most total quality management programs do, they focus on identifying what is wrong, finding the course of the error, and removing it. When you get rid of what you don't want, you do not necessarily get what you do want, and you may get something a lot less. When we try to solve problems like this, we just move them around. Ackoff gives the illustration of alcohol prohibition in the U.S. In the 1920s, alcoholism was seen as a major problem. It was seen as a defect, and policymakers wanted to get rid of it, so they asked what is to blame in causing this problem. The answer was clear: alcohol consumption. So they passed the Volstead Act, an act to prohibit intoxicating beverages. This did not have the effect of getting rid of alcohol. Though it made it illegal, it was still plentiful. What it did do, though, was create organized crime, and organized crime has been a much larger problem since than alcoholism ever was. The same could be seen with drugs in the 1960s. Complex systems are often described as counterintuitive. When we take our traditional ways of thinking that apply to simpler systems and project them onto these more complex organizations, we often get counterproductive results because they do not apply. This is the first lesson to learn about complex problems. They are not a function of any part in the system. They are a product of how the system is structured, and thus we have to change our way of tackling them from parts to the whole. That means looking at and trying to map out the structure of the whole system and how that structure of feedback loops and interdependencies creates the behavior of the system. And we will be going in depth on this in future modules. The second most important thing to learn is that you cannot directly change a complex organization. You can directly affect changes within parts, but not the whole system. A critical factor that is changing today is that we are going from designing relatively simple systems, like chairs and houses, where it is small enough and simple enough that we can impose our design on it, to dealing with systems that are much greater than we are. In a simple world, you can change the system. In a complex world, no one actor gets to change the system they are a part of. However, every actor has an influence on the system's evolution. You can choose to have a greater or lesser influence on its evolution. We can control our car because it is a relatively simple system, but we cannot control the traffic because it is a complex system. Yet each one of our actions has an influence on the overall traffic pattern. No one of us can solve climate change, but each one of our actions affects it. We give up complete control and certainty, but each one of us gains influence. Complex systems change through an evolutionary process, and thus systems change is really all about evolution. If we look at really major changes that have transformed societies, we will see that no one person or organization created that change. Take as an example the movement of Western society from a feudal system into the modern world, which certainly qualifies as a major change within a complex adaptive system. No one director chose to make that change. No one caused it to happen. It was a process of cultural, social, economic, and technological evolution. This massively parallel set of processes and small changes taking place in all these different systems eventually coalesced to take us into a new paradigm. That is the way that change happens in large, complex adaptive systems. Because complex adaptive systems consist of all these agents making decisions locally, we can't impose a design pattern on the organization and get the desired and predicted outcomes. However, what we can do is work with the system's natural potential for change, and that change happens through a process of evolution. The job of the system innovator, then, is to understand the system and its potential for change and to create the context for those variants that may be successful to grow and become more prevalent within the system, thus influencing it in a certain direction. This process of systems change can then be seen as very much analogous to the way an ecosystem adapts to its changing environment through the process of natural selection and evolution. Indeed, that is all we can actually do as systems innovators, help the organization adapt to its environment. To think that we get to make a plan and direct the organization in the direction of that pre-specified outcome is just an illusion. It is a failure to recognize the complexity of the systems that we are dealing with. These are the two most important things to learn in systems innovation. Firstly, that it is not about the parts, but the structure of the whole system. Secondly, that you cannot impose a design pattern on a complex adaptive system and get the results that you expect. Unfortunately, it typically takes us as individuals, as organizations, and as societies massive amounts of wasted time, energy, and resources to learn these basic principles of systems change. These principles, in fact, follow naturally from an appreciation for the complexity of the systems we are dealing with. If you don't have an appreciation for the complexity of the system you operate in, then you will likely create an overly simplified model to try and respond to the issues. National health systems, the global food system, corporate supply chains, political organization, national water systems, the global financial market, metropolitan areas. These things are incredibly complex, and you need to start with an appreciation for that complexity, or you will make the same mistakes we have made countless times in the past. Making that conceptual quantum leap to embrace their complexity sets you on the right path to enable systems change, but it is just the beginning. So far, we have talked about systems innovation and systems change. But a third important factor in this equation is the new kind of issues and problems we face today. Systems innovation is designed to try to tackle what we call wicked problems, which are highly complex and difficult issues. Examples might include global cybersecurity, inequality, the question of global governance, issues associated with the financialization of our economies, as well as international crime, terrorism, urban renewal projects, or many of the forms of environmental degradation that we face. The defining feature of these issues is that they are not isolated problems, but they are, in a sense, emergent features of the complex systems that make up our world. We increasingly find that our economies and social organizations are no longer confined to these closed systems that fit nicely inside of the nation state, but instead, if we look, we will see that our food, our clothes, our media, our cars, our money are part of this very complex global network that now spans around the planet. Unfortunately, our science and much of our thinking has left us in a situation where we are far from understanding these complex systems and the new set of issues they present. Peter Senge puts it well when he says, whether you talk about energy, food, or water, we live in this web, all of us. We don't know where our food comes from and the consequence of the systems that produce and distribute it. We don't know where our energy comes from, and we don't know the consequences of our use of it. We don't know much about anything that affects our daily living because we live in an extraordinary web of systemic interdependence. It is, in my opinion, the defining feature of this age, and we are totally unprepared for it. We don't know how to see it. We don't know how to think about it. These very complex networks that we have created and now run our global economy not only deliver all the good things that we want, but they also create dysfunctionalities. It is these dysfunctionalities within complex networks that may be called wicked problems. Wicked problems are systemic and emergent, in that it is the very way that the parts interact locally that creates the emergent outcome of the problem. As a consequence, wicked problems cannot be isolated and tackled through the traditional linear approach. The patterns that characterize them form through self-organization within an almost infinite number of individual interactions. An overall structure emerges that incentivizes individuals to act in a particular way due to local incentives that perpetually create the same emergent overall behavior. Because the overall pattern emerges through endless interactions across dense networks, their many cause-effect relations can never be fully mapped out in real time. As an example, we can think of the issue of bribery within a society. If individuals across a network exchange bribes and corruption takes hold as a systemic pattern, it will create the incentives for even more individuals to adopt similar behaviors, while limiting those who might still wish not to engage. As more individuals accept this corruption as part of normal behavior, it will gain traction. This pattern is not a fixed structure with a single identifiable cause. It is rather a dynamic outcome of a multiplicity of distributed interactions. The pattern is continuously created on a daily basis through a network of interactions. As the famous American writer H.L. Mencken once said, "For every complex problem, there is an answer that is clear, simple, and wrong." With these complex problems, there is no simple solution, and there is no one solution. You have to affect the system at multiple points. This adds to the challenge because it reduces the focus of our effort. Our experience, which has been developed from exposure to simple systems, leads us to look close to the manifestation of the issue for a cause and solution. Most initiatives in the world are focused on a specific solution because this enables them to focus and concentrate their capabilities and resources and thereby exert a large enough influence to try and solve the given issue. This looks good. It may get you elected, and it may even work if the problem is relatively simple. But if it is truly complex, all that will happen is that you move the problem to another place in the system or push it out into the future. While one person claims their successes and blames others when it reoccurs, we really just go round in circles. Complex problems, quite simply, require multiple interventions by multiple different actors, which is counter to our traditional approach. When we have a problem, our traditional approach is to centralize power. If there is a problem with housing in a country, what will we do? We will create a high commission or head of housing and concentrate authority and capital in that position, expecting them to create a strategy and use their authority and resources to move people and things around to solve the problem. When it doesn't work, we just blame the person we put in charge. This is a very seductive approach because people like to have power. People like to have a feeling that someone is in charge and can get things done, and we like to have someone to blame when it does not work. This creates a comforting feedback loop as we stay pushing the problem around in circles, but it does not work to solve the problem. Complex systems are multidimensional and multi-layered and multi-scaled. You have to look at it from all of these dimensions and develop a solution on the different levels and across the different dimensions. Solving for one dimension or one problem will not be sufficed. This is why we talk about systems innovation and systems change, because with a complex problem, you actually have to change the whole system by affecting multiple different areas. This is the idea of multi-solving, which says maybe all of these issues aren't separate, where we have to pit them against each other and see the issues as separate, creating a new working group to go and tackle each one. We can instead step back and look at the whole system, how the parts are interrelated, and a change in one will affect another domain, looking for synergistic solutions that will solve for many factors. Take, for example, the water-food-energy nexus. This nexus perspective increases the understanding of the interdependencies across the water, energy, and food sectors, and looks at how they may affect climate change and biodiversity. A nexus-based approach tries to reduce trade-offs and build synergies across sectors, recognizing that it may not be possible to solve a problem within one domain without solving an interrelated one in another domain. Thus, it aims to increase opportunities for mutually beneficial responses and enhancing the potential for cooperation between and among all sectors. As with all interdisciplinary approaches, it recognizes that interdependencies lead to the need for a collaborative approach, the need to develop multi-stakeholder platforms. The general idea is that as systems go from being relatively simple to being relatively complex, they go from being closed and independent to becoming open and interdependent. As a consequence, our approach has to shift from the traditional closed organization, focusing resources on a single issue, to creating open platforms that work with the relations between the parts, which form the whole emergent outcome. This is a systems approach. So far, we have identified systems innovation as a change in the structure of a complex system that generates new patterns to its operations and behavior. Such changes are not achieved by changing any of the parts, but require a reorganization of the connections and flows of information within the system. As Rachel Wharton of London Funders writes, systems change is about addressing the root causes of social problems, which are often intractable and embedded in networks of cause and effect. It is an intentional process designed to fundamentally alter the components and structures that cause the system to behave in a certain way. In this video, we are going to look at two good examples of systems-level innovations: 3D printing and distributed ledgers. The first good example of systems innovation is 3D printing, or more generally, distributed manufacturing. Why would this qualify as systems innovation? It qualifies because it is a reorganizing of the whole manufacturing system that is different to the way it was done in the past, and one that will lead to the system exhibiting new dynamics and behaviors. As we will illustrate, it reorganizes the system in such a way as to address fundamental issues so that the new model will not go on creating the same problems as before. Historically, we have done manufacturing through the traditional centralized approach, the factory being the icon of this model. It is based around a model of mass production so as to reduce unit cost and push out standardized products to end users. An innovation within that paradigm would be to maybe improve a machine on the production line and thus make it more efficient while leaving the basic pattern to how we produce and distribute manufactured goods unchanged. This is, however, not what distributed manufacturing does. Firstly, 3D printing engenders a restructuring in that core design pattern of centralization, which is critical to how the whole system is organized. Instead of bringing everything into the center, concentrating production capabilities in a few large facilities, and focusing on improving the efficiency of those units, distributed manufacturing flips this around and pushes that production capability out to the end users. As a consequence of making such a major design pattern change to the system, the outcome of how the system behaves would be very different. Many of the issues we have with our current system would immediately disappear. For example, if implemented at scale, distributed manufacturing would totally rewire the global logistics and supply chain network. Not only this, but it would also rewrite our demand for basic materials and reshape the face of retail and commerce. It would turn end users into producers, and it would likely change the current linear model into a cyclical model, thus solving many current issues surrounding pollution and overconsumption. This is systems change. And there is an interesting thing to note here. Whereas you might think the 3D printing revolution is all about the technology, it is not. 3D printers have been around for many decades before anyone really became interested in them. The difference was that before they were seen as just tools for making prototypes that would then be mass-produced. What changed was simply that we started to look at them as personal fabricators and started to conceive of distributed manufacturing. Another good example of systems innovation would be triple entry accounting, or more generally, distributed ledger technology, DLT. DLT makes it possible for a network of computers to maintain a shared, secure, and trusted ledger of valuable assets and exchanges without anyone controlling the network or anyone being able to alter the ledger without the consent of other nodes in the network. Why are DLTs a good example of systems innovation? Primarily because they represent a change on probably the most fundamental level of economic organization. That is to say, how we record the ownership and exchange of valued assets of all kind. Today, in advanced economies, the ownership of assets is recorded in digital databases, and who gets to manage and update those databases is, of course, a central locus of power and authority in society. Traditionally, those databases have been centralized as we created a set of industrial-age bureaucratic institutions to record ownership and manage those records. The banks, insurance companies, hospitals, and a myriad of other public institutions that were backed and regulated by the national legal system. Aside from owning large amounts of weapons, being able to define who has what and how it is exchanged is an ultimate source of power within society. Changing this would rewrite very fundamental structures underpinning our modern economies. But this is exactly what distributed ledger technology does. By moving the storage and validation of valuable records and exchanges to a distributed system and away from the centralized institutions of government and enterprises, they could rewire the flow of power and value within society. That is a structural change within the economy. One obvious implication is that it restructures power imbalances within society, as people come to own their own data and records of value. This would have a huge impact on an issue that is of great concern currently, inequality. But we can note that there was no revolution to overthrow the capitalists or an election to create a universal basic income, both of which would be a symptom-level intervention. The structure of the system is changed, and that creates new dynamics that render the old ones no longer relevant. This is the nature of evolution. Change happens not necessarily by the old things disappearing, but by the context changing. Those things that do not adapt may well go on existing, but are no longer relevant to the new issues at hand, while those things that do adapt become relevant and we start to invest our resources and attention in those. Just as the Stone Age did not end because we ran out of stones, but because a new technological paradigm emerged. And just as our societies no longer worry about witches anymore, because the whole cultural paradigm within our societies has changed. System-level change and evolution creates a new context within which the old issues become irrelevant, as resources start to flow in new directions, bypassing those that have failed to adapt, while starting to flow through those that present the optimal path given the new context. That is how whole, complex adaptive systems change. Innovation is the process of creating and introducing a new solution to a given constraint. At its heart, innovation is a creative process, an inherently disorganized and messy one. Systems thinkers argue that interventions do not always produce orderly, sequential, and contained outcomes. Instead, an ongoing process of action, learning, and adaptation is needed to bring about systems change. Central to this process, and indeed you might say the origins of this process, is discontent with what is. Innovation starts with a discontent for what is. If you are happy with the way the world is, you will never change much. You may find two people working on a car assembly line. The one who is quite happy with the job, happy with the way cars are made, their salary, and their place in the world. This person will just go on working the same as before, indefinitely. The other, who is discontent, will search for ways to not stay doing what they are doing, and channeling that in a constructive way will lead them to finding a different, faster, or better way of doing things. It is our discontent with some aspect of our world that drives us to conceive of a different, better world. No matter how big or small that discontent is, and how big or small that vision of a better world is, it is what drives innovation and change. Innovation is a creative process. Creative processes do not happen by staying in our comfort zone. New things get created out of tensions, frictions, conflict created by contradictions that are waiting to be resolved, but others shy away from them. It is often said that the capacity of a first-rate intellect is to hold two contradictory ideas at the same time. We have to be able to envision an ideal world, but at the same time be open to the reality in front of us that is typically far from that. Peter Senge articulates this well when he says, "The energy of the creative process comes from this gap. How do you generate the gap? Obviously, when you start to articulate a vision, you generate that energy. But just as much when you start to see more clearly the current reality, that also generates tension. There are two fundamental ways to generate creative tension. One is by articulating and getting committed to a vision, and the other, it is about getting clearer about what is. So to put it simply, two sources of creative tension are aspiration and the truth." Somewhat paradoxically, real change is as much about accepting what is as it is about envisioning a different future. To go through the creative process is to hold those two that create the contradictions, to live with them and use them as the fuel to your creativity, and eventually create some resolution to them. It is that resolution to the constraint or contradiction that will then work as a generic solution that others can use without having to go through that full process. We have to have a vision of a perfect world and a sense of the real world. We have to hold the ideal and the real without slipping too far into either. Energy is not a thing, it is the potential difference between two things. Without two different things, there is no potential energy, no capacity to do work, and in this case, no creative process. The real contradiction and tension that drives this whole process is the difference between the real and the ideal. When those two things are one, then it is game over. In the end, either you have given up and your ideas have become the real, or you have achieved them and the real has become your ideal. Either way, the creative process is over. It is the journey in between that matters, where you are fueled by the difference between the two. The solution may take the form of an institution, a process, or technology. But what the innovation is really the product of your resolution of the contradiction you manage to live with and resolve during the process of innovation. Put simply, if you don't feel uncomfortable with yourself about something, you are fundamentally not creating. It is when you put yourself into a space that is uncomfortable for you, when you accept and live with some opinion or perspective that creates dissonance within your accepted paradigm, that is the opportunity for innovation and change. Indeed, we might extrapolate that out to say that it is our collective societal discontent with the world we have created that is the fuel enabling systems change on a macro level. Tension may be the fuel, but the actual innovation process requires deep insight, prolonged analysis, systems design, and development. As we will discuss in a coming module, if you want to innovate in a system, it is not just necessary that you understand the current form of that system, but also understand it in the abstract. Understanding the system in the abstract shows you the full set of possibilities for that system, and it is that set of possibilities that creates the space for innovation. By understanding what you are dealing with as a system, you will be able to see what its function is, and that provides some rationale as to what is better and what is worse. It is only with insight that we can see beyond what exists to what might exist. Complex systems are counterintuitive. Our first understanding of the system and the problems at hand are typically close to the complete opposite of what is really going on. The people and organizations within the system will have all sorts of agendas that will create all sorts of narratives surrounding the nature of the system and where the problems are coming from. To actually understand what is going on requires deep and prolonged analysis of how the parts interrelate to create the system's behavior. All complex systems have a history that shapes their present and future. It is critical to understand how the system has evolved to its current state and the evolutionary potential that exists within the system now, which will enable it to move forward. With systems innovation, we are not creating something new. All complex systems are the product of long evolutionary processes. We never really get to a clean slate to simply build a new one from scratch. All we can do is work with the evolutionary potential within the system. Systems innovation is costly and rare. Systems don't change fundamentally unless they really have to, because it is a difficult, costly exercise that the system might not survive. It is part of the basic survival mechanism of a system not to undertake large-scale structural change unless it is absolutely necessary. Of David Snowden's 3 necessary conditions for innovation, the first 2 are starvation and pressure. As such, it only happens when a complex system is in a state of transition. In a normal state, you only get incremental innovations. It is only during transitions, when the system is in a state of crisis and exponential change, that it has the potential to adopt a new way or model of organization. It is only during these phase transitions that there is enough positive feedback to drive exponential change and qualitative changes in structure. System change is about enabling these nonlinear transitions. To do systems innovation is to understand the basic structures of the current system and the potential to evolve to a higher level of organization along some set of trajectories. Complex problems require a prolonged effort by a multiplicity of actors. To coordinate that effect requires the building of a platform that can support a network of actors to coordinate around the given issues. Take, for example, the issue of obesity. If we were to look at all of the drivers behind obesity, there is no single one. In fact, there are maybe 50 to 100 drivers behind it, with probably hundreds of different organizations that are producing and impacting the level of obesity. In a world like that, a command and control centralized organization will not work. One genius sitting in a room is not going to solve the problem. These complex problems require a form of innovation which is fundamentally democratized and distributed, but also coordinated and working together over a prolonged period. In short, Don't build an organization, because most of the people and resources you will need to tackle the issue will be outside of it. Only a tiny fraction of the resources you will need to tackle the issue will be inside of it, and thus you will not be able to do much. To harness those resources outside, you need to instead create a network, a platform as a vehicle for collaboration and coordination. When presented with very complex, messy systems, people often get overwhelmed, and they become overly pragmatic. They move rapidly towards practical solutions, fearing that idealism is impossible. We often take the last steps first, fearful of idealism, or are just too lazy to put in the work. We skip over the initial phases of building up real insight into the workings of the system and jump into practicalities. We take for granted the vision, the goal, and the current manifestation of the system as just the way it is. Of course, by doing this, we are throwing out the very opportunity to reinvent it. We are just creating all sorts of impossibilities and constraints for ourselves further down the line that will ultimately lead us back into the same patterns of thoughts and action that have had limited success in the past. Systems are abstract things. A transport system is not a thing like a car that you can touch or hold. It is a complex network of connections that you will never be able to fully see or touch. The only way you will ever be able to grasp a large transport system will be through some abstract model or map. The point is, without abstract models, we are going nowhere. Practicality is great, but practicality alone will get you nowhere. Whether we like it or not, complexity means that we have to move to higher levels of abstraction. We cannot do complexity without theories and models. We cannot be afraid of embracing abstraction and letting go of practicalities. If you start with budget constraints or stakeholder analysis, we will not get very far. There is a place for those things, but it is later on, once the theory is figured out. As a general principle, what is wrong in theory cannot be right in practice. Only what is right in theory will deliver sustainable solutions. And we will only know what is right in theory by doing the theorizing. Abstract theories open our eyes to possibilities and solutions that we would otherwise bypass. They enable us to see and search a broader space in order to find solutions that we otherwise could not even imagine. That is the problem with assumptions. We assume there is nothing out there, that we already have the answer, when in fact there may be a much better solution, but you are not going to find it without looking, and theories give us that capacity to see. Innovation is a search, and models are the tools that let us see. Systems innovation can be seen to be based upon the premise that incremental change of the parts is not going to solve the real issues at hand. The idea that what needs to change in the system is not any of its parts, but the very structure of the system as a whole. Of course, the point of changing the system is to some way improve it. There is no point in changing a system if you are going to make it worse or the same as before. Our basic premise here is this: you can't improve a system without understanding it. The problem is that most people do not understand the system they are a part of. This is a key issue we have. Most of us have an idea for what a system is. Many of us know something about systems thinking, or even ascribe to being systems thinkers, but actually very few of us are able to understand the organizations we operate within in a systemic way. As Russell Ackoff puts it, although everyone is aware that a corporation, a school, a hospital, a society, or a government is a system, practically no one knows what a system is. That is not nearly as important as the fact that they are not aware of what being in a system implies for effective management. And that is where we are going wrong, as a nation and as part of the Western economy. It is the failure to understand what is required to be an effective manager of a system. If you don't understand what you are doing as a system, you do not understand its dynamical behavior. But worse than this, without really understanding it, you have no objective criteria for what is better and worse. Without understanding the system, you have only your subjective interpretation of how you would like it to be. This subjective interpretation is typically just based upon your desire for the system to conform to your interests. It is really just a desire to alter the system so that it accommodates you better, although that will likely be masqueraded in all sorts of psychological tricks to dress it up as some kind of great altruism about how you are helping others and saving the world. The world is not short of these kinds of great altruists who think that if they could just get in power, or if their leader could just get into power, then they would be able to straighten the whole thing out to the benefit of humanity. Of course, what they are lacking is quite simply an understanding of the system they are operating in. With only this narrow understanding, we create a unidimensional solution and try to get into a place of authority so as to impose that on others, and we often do it with the best of intentions. The results of not investing in developing our insight into the system is we spend our time fighting over who should be in authority and which subjective perspective should be implemented. The result is either a dictatorship of one subjective solution crowding out all others, or a democracy where we go round in a circle as we cycle from one subjective perspective being imposed before another set of people come into power with their opinions and rewrite what happened before. No real progress is made in either scenario as we shift the blame, create unintended consequences, and simply go round in circles, sometimes getting lucky and making progress before fortunes turn and things go in the opposite direction. The root issue here is, of course, that we do not properly understand the system we are a part of, and thus have not been able to create objective metrics for improvement and to overcome our own subjective interests. Systems thinking starts with a degree of reflexivity. It asks that we look at our own assumptions, paradigms, and desires, question those, and try to go beyond them to achieve some kind of objectivity in our reasoning and course of action. As Mahatma Gandhi said, if you want to change the world, start with yourself. Then you stand a chance of understanding the world around you as in some way separate of your own desires, interests, and motives. This is when you gain some kind of greater objective view of the system you form part of, and you have the potential to actually change it. Some think that Africa is full of poor people who need us to go and save them, when in fact, if we stopped and made an in-depth assessment of Africa's social and economic systems, we would likely find quite the opposite. In the process of stopping, looking, listening, and reflecting, we overcome our ego and create the potential for doing something of real benefit to the system, rather than just of benefit to ourselves. Thus, systems innovation starts with trying to gain a deep understanding of the system you are trying to innovate in. This is not just an analysis of its current form and functionality. You have to actually understand it in the abstract. That is, to understand the system independent of its current form. For example, if you're trying to improve the electrical power grid in India, this may start with an abstract question of what is an energy system. If you want to improve the network of hospitals in Australia, start with the question, what is a health system? This makes sense because the point of innovation is to create something different from what exists. If your point of reference is solely what exists, your potential for creating something different is limited. The broader you start your inquiry, the wider the net you are casting, the less you are likely to miss anything, and the greater your space to create a true paradigm shift in the system. System innovation is about starting not with the specific problems that you are currently facing, but instead starting with the system as a whole, so as to make a change on the level that will make current issues no longer relevant. We do not worry about overuse of fossil fuels, because if we could make real innovation in the whole system, we would probably not even need them. A better way of doing things would emerge. By going to this very abstract level, we start to see the full set of possibilities and break out of thinking that only what exists is possible. We have to start from a clean slate and then later reintroduce the practical limiting constraints. By doing this, we can break out of our assumptions. People will often say that things are done the way they are because this is the only way they could be. When you ask for change, they will present all sorts of reasons why change is impossible and things have to be the way they are. But if we want to be truly innovative, we have to test every single one of the constraints that are presented to us. Don't take anything for granted, and don't accept the constraints of people who have all sorts of motives not to change the system. They will always present it as an immutable structure, naturally created out of some given force inherent in the design of the universe. If you were some upstart 500 years ago, this is exactly what the Catholic Church would have said to you, that the rule of the Catholic Church was written in the stars, and this is just the way it is and will always be. Those same forces of inertia are all around us, telling us that change is impossible, that banks are so large they will never fade away, that Facebook has so many users it could never be superseded, that the nation-state is an immutable part of the social order. Some things are impossible, but you will never know which ones are and are not until you take your understanding of the system you are building to the abstract level, where anything is possible, and then start to reintroduce all of the components required to make that system a reality. As you go along, question and test each and every element to see what is really possible, and thus what the real constraints are. If you can do this, what you will see is that the existing system is but one solution to the given problem. It is but one concrete instantiation of the abstract system, and you will start to see the other options available to you. This is, of course, critical to enabling systems-level innovation, because it creates a space of possibilities much larger than would normally be the case, and thus creates the possibility for a much larger scale of transformation. As a general principle, you should not alter a system unless you really understand how it is working. If you are Beethoven or James Joyce, then you can break the rules and build something better. But they could only do that because they had first mastered the languages they were using. As Donella Meadows notes, don't be an unthinking intervener and destroy the system's own self-maintenance capacities. Before you charge in to make things better, pay attention to the value of what's already there. Most complex systems have many layers of abstraction and organization that are hidden from immediate visibility and understanding. As we have grown up in these systems, it is often very difficult for us to appreciate all the layers of order and organization that was just given to us, built by someone in the past and now so well established that we take it for granted. Few of us appreciate all the layers of social institutions, legal frameworks, political organization, financial institutions, public administration, etc., required to achieve the level of functionality and organization that we have achieved so far within developed economies, or even have an understanding of this on the level of just one enterprise. Most of the major systems we are interested in are complex adaptive systems that have evolved over a prolonged period, and the function and components that form part of them have been subjected to evolutionary selection under a multiplicity of conditions over decades or centuries. If you have survived a prolonged process of evolution, it typically means you are there for some reason. Whether that is positive or negative, it still means that the system in some way needs that component or connection, and you should be careful before you do something to it. Indeed, we can note that a lot of our current environmental challenges come from the fact that we have started to alter major Earth systems without understanding how they work and all the dependencies within our socio-ecological systems. Changing a system without a deep understanding of its structure and dynamics will just lead to unintended consequences. It is probably better to live with a dysfunctional system until you understand its workings than to try and change it when you do not yet have a comprehensive understanding of it in the abstract. To do system innovation successfully, you ultimately need a deep insight into the workings of that system that will provide a base for you to know what is needed and what is not needed.
Systems innovation can be seen to be based upon the premise that the system we are interested in is not functioning on a foundational level, or a vision of how the whole system could be better. When we extrapolate this out, we can recognize that many of the systems in our society and economy are not functioning as they could. We often hear the word broken associated with healthcare or educational systems. There is widespread recognition to the unsustainability of many systems, such as how we do food production, to how we manufacture, retail, and use consumer goods. This leads us to the conclusion that maybe there's something not quite right about this whole set of systems that make up our economies. Once one comes to this insight, one is then invariably driven to make some inquiry about why and what might be done about it. A superficial inquiry would lead us to the conclusion that whoever is managing these systems is just doing a bad job. And if we could just replace those people and get the good guys in charge, then all would be fine again. But a more prolonged and sustained inquiry would lead us to question the structure of the system these actors are within. If we sustain our inquiry even farther, we may come to the recognition that how we design and manage these systems is, of course, a product of the models we hold about the way the world is, and more broadly, our processes of reasoning that go into the decisions we make. This is the conclusion that systems thinkers typically come to, that the way we organize our world is a product of the models that we use. And if there is something fundamentally dysfunctional with our organizations, then it is unlikely to be out there, but instead a product of our reasoning and modeling. The imbalances in the world are typically traced back to imbalances in our reasoning. The position that an excess of a particular mode of reasoning, called analytical reductionism, has resulted in an imbalance to how we understand, design, and manage our world. Indy Johar, serial co-founder of Social Ventures, describes this well when he says, "A lot of the economic and organizational model that we live in was born in the Enlightenment. And how it was born was we decided that we could understand the world by treating everything in vitro, putting in glass. We could understand the world by isolating science from art, understand chemistry from biology. We suddenly took the world and we could fragment everything out, and that world allowed us to perceive the world almost like it was infinite, because we could see everything through its definiteness, and that world has been amazing. It's allowed us to do incredible things, but actually what it's also started to do is bring into crisis issues like climate change. When none of the individual's in vitro analysis works, because actually it's all about the interactions. Suddenly, the cost of interactions, those things that we don't care about or aren't designed to care about, are coming back to haunt us. Systems thinking recognizes two broad and qualitatively different processes of reasoning that guide our decisions and the actions we take. What is called synthetic holism and analytical reductionism. It is important to understand these two modes of reasoning, as much of what is talked about in systems and complexity theory follow from them. Analytical reductionism is a process of reasoning where we try to understand something by removing it from its environment, decomposing it into individual parts, studying the properties of those parts, and then putting them back together, so as to derive an account of the whole as some combination of these individual building blocks. It is based upon the assumption that the system is nothing more than the sum of its parts, and that the system is relatively closed. In contrast, synthetic holism is a process of reasoning where we try to understand something by looking at it in relation to the whole system or environment that it forms part of, its interaction with other systems, and how it is shaped by those interactions and the overall context. For example, given the job of trying to understand a tree in a forest, each method would take a different approach that would lead to a very different vision of the tree. Whereas reductionism would isolate one tree and study its internal components while assuming all other trees are similar to that, and that the forest is just an additive summation of all those similar trees. Synthetic holism would look at the whole forest and try to understand why the tree is the way it is because of its interaction with other creatures and the whole system. It would see each tree as different because it was shaped by its local nexus of interactions. Synthesis and analysis are very fundamental paradigms of reasoning and thus lead to very different ways of viewing, acting, and organizing our world. Both are equally valid, but both are equally incomplete without the other. The systems thinking perspective posits that we need a balance in our reasoning between these two paradigms. This insight leads systems thinkers to identify an imbalance in our reasoning as the source of the major systems-level challenges we face today, and some form of correction to that imbalance as critical to reimagining our world and moving forwards. This perspective sees a massive proliferation of a single mode of analytical reasoning beginning with the rise of the modern era and the scientific revolution, and traces it through to the world we live in today. As a reductionist form of science became the conceptual backbone of our modern understanding of the world, finding expression in our new engineering and management methods with the end result being the industrial economic model that we inherit today. For systems thinkers, the fundamental issue that we face today is not any of the problems we usually think of. It is instead traced back to an overdependence in excess of a particular analytical vision of the world. From this perspective, a transformation beyond the current industrial model needs to start with a rebalancing of our way of thinking, incorporating synthetic holism as an equally valid mode of reasoning, to counterbalance the excesses of a reductionist approach. With analysis, we perform differentiation, which means looking at the difference between things. We break systems down, we divide them up, and look at what makes them separate. The result is that we end up in a world of little atomic units. An excess of this mode of reasoning can leave us in a fractured, compartmentalized world without the capacity to integrate and overcome differences. We start thinking that the environment and economy are two separate things, and that we have to make trade-offs between them. A society or organization that has become too differentiated may have exceptional specialized capabilities, but it will lack the capacity to overcome its divides and integrate as a whole organization when necessary. The analytical approach downplays the importance of the relations between things. It sees the world as fundamentally a set of parts that can simply be moved around and recombined without taking account of the specific forms of relations between those parts that might alter how they behave. In reality, the way things are interconnected into whole systems has a very strong influence on how they operate and behave. We often do not understand the complexities of that. Based upon the assumptions of reductionism, we assume that it is the properties of the parts that matter, and that all we have to do is find some cause that will affect a change in the part, and we can manage the system through those linear cause and effect interactions. When we go in the opposite direction, we are trying to integrate things. We look for what connects them and is common to both. An excess of this form of reasoning blinds us to the details. Everything starts to become one. We lose the benefits of the division of labor and specialization. In our organization or society, the parts start to become subordinate to the whole and become homogeneous, lacking individuality. Organizations inevitably go through different stages in their development of integration and differentiation. But if you want a functioning system, this is one that has achieved a balance between the two paradigms. It is the health system that has many different capacities, but is able to bring them together and integrate them as one around the end user's needs. It is the person that has many different interests, but is able to integrate them and bring them together in the work that they do. It is the political system that contains many different opinions, but is able to focus and synthesize them into balanced and acceptable policies. Although the reductionist approach has brought us specialization with the many great achievements that have followed from that, it has also resulted in excessive compartmentalization. If we look at the issues we face with many of our systems today, from health to governance to finance, we will see that they have become overbearingly fractured, compartmentalized, and complicated, rendering them inert in the face of much needed change. This is a consequence of reductionism. The solution to that is integration, connecting horizontally across those subsystems to integrate them into a whole. That is a very different dynamic to what we have been doing for the past centuries, and it requires a different mode of thinking, systems thinking, to look at how the parts interconnect into a whole. In order to do systems change, we have to understand whatever it is we are trying to change as a system. And this requires that we actually create a systems model of it. Most of us do not see systems, we just see things. And as a consequence, we have designed our world based upon this component-based vision. We might say that we have a transport system, a health system, or a political system. However, our actual model of those is typically not a system at all. It is just a set of parts. A university is just a set of departments without any understanding of how all those parts fit together to produce a complete learning experience for the student. Healthcare is likewise a set of actors that interact. without much understanding of how their actions fit into the function and behavior of the whole system. We have people doing health insurance, health finance, health policy, clinicians, hospital management, etc. But none of those people really understand themselves as being part of a system that is working together towards delivering a function to meet the end user's needs. The insurers are interested in insurance, the clinicians in their medical procedures, regulators are interested in laws and compliance, etc. It may sound funny, but no one is really looking at these things as systems. We have ended up in a world of sets where the whole is thought to be just a summation of its parts, and thus requires no special attention. The same is true for finance, energy, food, and other areas. We traditionally just look at these things in terms of their parts. No one is really looking at these things as systems, because that requires a different way of thinking to the one we are used to. But if you are serious about systems change, then you have to be able to model what you are dealing with as a system. Otherwise, you will simply be doing what everyone else is trying to do, which is improve the efficiency of the parts, leading at best to incremental change, before eventually you get displaced by a new paradigm. We are trying all the time to elevate our thinking about a problem, from seeing only parts to seeing the system's structure and behavior that creates those issues. To do that, we need some kind of model of the whole system, no matter how crude that overall insight might be. A system is a set of parts that are interrelated to perform some collective function. There are just two types of composite entities in the world: sets and systems. Sets are a collection of elements that are independent. Because they are independent, they cannot function together to achieve anything more than the sum of their effects in isolation. A pile of stones is just a set, because they are not organized and interrelated towards a common function. The weight of the whole pile will be equal to the sum of the weights of all the stones taken separately. To call something a system is to say that the set of elements are interdependent in affecting some joint outcome. Every kind of organization in our economies that we are interested in is a system. There is an important aspect to note here, which is this. The difference between a system and just a set of parts is the way the parts are interrelated. That means everything that we are interested in when it comes to systems is the relations, the connections, and the interdependencies that give rise to the functioning of the whole. The whole that emerges and the overall functionality of the system is a product of the way the parts are interrelated. This is why in systems innovation, we are interested not in parts, but connections. We are not trying to change the parts as per the usual approach. We are trying to change the connection so that we get the emergence of new macro-level structures and new whole systems functionality. A model of a system needs to capture and take account of a few key aspects. It has to define the elements within the system, the types of relations between those component parts, how those parts interrelate into a whole system that performs some function, and how the whole system interacts with its environment, adapts, and evolves over time. Say, for example, we are dealing with a local food system. We would first have to identify the different elements and their properties: the farmers, the natural resources, agribusiness, the government regulators, etc. Then identify the types of relations between them. The farmers require water. The agribusiness lobby government regulators that provide grants to the farmers, etc. We need some understanding of how the whole food system interrelates to create a certain functional pattern. What does this food system produce at the end of the day? How does it interact with the broader environment of the economy, society, culture, political system, ecosystem, and how is this whole dynamic changing over time? All systems are composed of elements which are the basic building blocks. Elements are things like people, banks, computers, or cities. They can have properties associated with them. They can be larger or smaller. They can be part of a certain category of things like advanced economies or emerging economies. You have to identify the basic units, their essential distinctive characteristics and properties, which will create the categories to give your model some structure. A systems model consists of a set of elements, with relations between those elements through which they are interdependent. Relations can have many attributes, but the most fundamental one is the type of synergy. Do the components interact in a fashion that is constructive or destructive, adding value to the whole or depleting value from the whole? The relation between bees and flowering plants is an example of a positive synergy. That is to say, they work together in a constructive fashion, adding some value to the whole greater than that of the parts. The runoff pollutants from a factory and a river ecosystem interact through a negative synergy. When combined, they have a destructive effect on the whole environment. The overall functionality of the system will be a product of the constructive or destructive synergies between the parts. A functioning system is one that has more positive synergies than negative synergies, because the parts are interrelated in a fashion that enables the emergence of overall functionality. A dysfunctional system is one that has many negative synergies, so that the parts are interfering, making them incapable of delivering an overall function. There is much more to the dynamics of the interrelationships between the parts in a system, but we will cover this in a future module on system dynamics. All of the systems we're interested in perform some function, or else we would not be interested in them. Thus, a critical part of understanding any system is to ask, what is the function of this system? The answer to that question is not always as obvious as it may seem. Many people have never really questioned what is the function of the system they operate within, and have only a superficial understanding of it. What is the function of a financial system? The financial system accounts for and enables the exchange of economic value between people. What is the function of a water system? A water system performs the function of accessing and transferring water to when and where people need. What is the function of the political system? A political system performs the function of making collectively binding decisions for a community of people. What is the function of a manufacturing system? To fabricate goods, and so on. An understanding of the functioning of the system gives us an answer to the question why. Why do we use or need this system? By refining that question, we can come to define some metric of what is functional and of value, and what is dysfunctional, what we might call entropy. By understanding the functioning of the system within its environment, we have some criteria for assessing it as a whole. This enables us to let go of any specific instantiation of the system, to start from the beginning by asking, what is the function, and what is really needed to deliver that function? Innovation does not happen without a space of possibilities. By looking at outcomes and functions, we can let go of the specific form of the current system and create an open space for innovation. By looking first at functionality, we can start by putting the outcomes to the system at the center of our vision. This is already a paradigm shift, because when we take an analytical approach, focusing on parts first, most of our talk starts to revolve around the input and internal workings of the system, and we quickly lose sight of its output and how it actually operates in its environment. Typically, we do not really ask what is the function or outcome of the system. We simply look at internal optimization of the parts. We assume that if the parts are working well, then the whole will be working, and we will get the outcomes that we desire. But this is a false assumption, as none of those things have to follow from each other. We focus on GDP, but we forget that it is really quality of life that people want, and these are two different things. The first is a measurement of how much resources are churning through the economy, and the second is an outcome. The analytical approach always focuses on the internal operations of closed systems. In so doing, it blinds us to the most important thing, which is how the system really functions within its environment, and the actual outcomes for end users. By looking at organizations as being fundamentally open, systems thinking can help us with identifying those real outcomes. Finally, we need some model for how the system exists within its environment and how it adapts to changes within that environment. How the whole system evolves over time as a consequence of the feedback interaction with its environment. In these large, complex systems, no one gets to define a linear process of development, but instead, they just evolve. This evolution involves a process where new variants are produced, selected for, and duplicated. Evolution is how whole societies, cultures, economies, or technology infrastructure develop over time, and we need some model to account for that. Complex systems exist on many different levels and scales. As we think about a system and try to model it, spend part of your time from a vantage point that lets you see the whole system, not just the problem that may have drawn you to focus on the system to begin with. In our analysis, we should be zooming in and out across all the scales and levels to the system, actively focusing on specific details of importance, but also taking time to step back and passively observe the whole. This looking at the system on various scales helps to identify how the way the parts interrelate create the whole pattern, and how that macro pattern then feedbacks to shape how the parts act. This micro-macro feedback dynamic is critical to understanding the overall dynamics of the system as it changes over time. There are a few basic models that are very helpful for thinking about system change. One of the most popular of these is what is called the iceberg model. The iceberg model tries to illustrate the various levels of abstraction to a situation or organization, from the observable events to underlying patterns that generate these, to the supporting structure and ultimately the mental models used by an organization. The iceberg model helps individuals and organizations to expand their perception of a situation, to see it within the context of the whole system and not limit themselves to looking at just a single activity or event. It is designed to help people to step back and identify the different patterns that the event is part of, the possible structures that might be causing it to occur, and finally, the model that is creating those structures. An iceberg is used as an analogy to represent the underlying structures generating perceived events and issues, as it is known to have only 10% of its total mass above the water, while 90% of it is underwater. The expression tip of the iceberg is used to connote that what one can see is only a small part of a whole situation, i.e., there is much more below the surface, and what it looks like may be surprising. Just like with an iceberg, a large percentage of what is going on in our world is hidden from view. And the iceberg model tries to make this explicit by depicting it as a series of layers that sit beneath the everyday phenomena observed. The iceberg model argues that events and patterns, which are observable, are caused by systemic structures and mental models, which are often hidden. A fundamental systems thinking concept is that different people in the same structure will produce similar results. That is to say, structure causes 80 to 90% of all issues, not so much the people. Thus, to understand behaviors, we must first identify and then understand the systemic structures and underlying mental models that cause them. The iceberg model typically identifies 4 basic levels to situations. Events, which represent the manifest components and actions observable to us. The patterns of behavior beneath this describe trends over time. System structure describes how the parts are interrelated to influence the patterns. Finally, the mental models that support everything else in the system through a set of beliefs, values, and assumptions shaping people's perception. The 1-minute snapshot of a current affair that we might see in the evening news is an example of an event within the iceberg model. Above the waterline are the events. Events are markers in time where multiple variables are observed. They are the what's happened or what we saw. They are discrete activities or facts about the state of things in the system, like catching a fish. If we apply the iceberg model to global issues, we could say that at the tip, above the water, are events, or things that we see or hear about happening in the world every day. That there is a new president in Italy, or that the price of commodities is up. The events that we hear about in the news represent the iceberg tip. Most of the world spends its time at the event level. It is how we perceive the world while being occupied with our daily activities. Patterns are the changes in variables that occur over time. They are the trends that we perceive taking place over time. If we look just below the waterline, we often start to see patterns or the recurrence of events. This might be, for example, recurring oil spills or one's computer periodically breaking down. Patterns are important to identify because they indicate that an event is not an isolated incident. Patterns answer the questions, what's been happening, or what's changing. When we make a statement like, it seems to be getting warmer in winter, or the price of gas is going down, these are patterns that we are observing, a series of relationships between events. When we get to the pattern level, we can anticipate, plan, and forecast. It allows us to adapt to problems so we can react more effectively to them. The structure supports, creates, and influences the patterns we see in the events. Structures can be understood as the rules of the game. They can be written or unwritten. They can be physical and visible or invisible. They are rules, norms, policies, guidelines, power structures, distribution of resources, or informal ways of work that have been tacitly or explicitly institutionalized. They answer the question, what might explain these patterns? It may not be easy to see the structure, but the patterns we can see tell us that the structure must be there. Structures are composed of cause and effect relationships. These are connections between patterns. For example, a farmer might say, if I increase the number of cows, I will get more milk. She is saying there is a connection between an increasing number of cows, a pattern, and an increasing amount of milk, another pattern. Or, for example, the underlying structure of a problem, such as recurring oil spills, might be our dependence on fossil fuels. But if you look at the root cause of such spills, you can start to understand and address long-term, sustainable solutions, such as developing alternative energy sources that do not rely on oil shipment. The mental model used to perceive the world is ultimately what generates the structures, patterns, and events. Below the structures are the mental models. These define the thinking that creates the structures that then manifest themselves in the patterns of events. Mental models are people's deeply held assumptions and beliefs that ultimately drive behavior. There is typically not just one pattern or structure or mental model at play. There can be many. Mental models are the attitudes, beliefs, morals, expectations, values, or culture that allow structures to continue functioning as they are. These are the beliefs that we often learn subconsciously from our society or family and are likely unaware of. Mental models are ultimately what keep the structure doing what it does. They are the thoughts and processes of reasoning that need to exist to cause the structure to be the way it is. These ideas exist in the minds of the structure's stakeholders, the people who set up the structure or those that play a role in the way it operates. Mental models are typically difficult to identify in that they engender many assumptions that are never made explicit. An example of the iceberg model may be seen in one's own health. Catching a cold would be an event. Catching colds more often when we are tired is a pattern. The systemic structures or causes for getting tired might include lack of rest from excessive work, which might in turn be a product of a mental model surrounding our identity as a hard-working person. One tends to get caught up in the immediate event of suffering from a cold and typically forgets that it is part of a pattern of events that is caused by the underlying structures of our lifestyle and perception. The iceberg model that we looked at previously not only illustrates the different dimensions of an issue, but also offers insight into how to enact change most effectively within the system through what are called leverage points. A leverage point is a place within a system where small changes can have large effects. The lower we go in the iceberg, the more leverage we have for transforming the system. For example, changing structures and influencing mental models has a broader, more far-reaching effect than reacting in the moment and firefighting discrete events. Thus, the only real way to find high leverage points is to first find the root causes. The iceberg metaphor helps to illustrate that if we somehow altered the event on top without finding a solution to the cause, the buoyancy of the ice underneath would simply push up to recreate the tip again. As such, only the most superficial of issues can be resolved at this higher level. Symptomatic responses attempt to push on the system at low leverage points to resolve immediate causes. This works on easy problems, because on easy problems, the forces arising from root causes are small enough to be overcome by pushing on low leverage points. Systems change requires affecting the organization at high leverage points to resolve root causes. This approach is required on difficult problems, since problem solvers can exert only limited amounts of force on a large system. If that force is applied at low instead of high leverage points, it will be overcome by the forces of the innate dynamics of the system that arise from the root causes. Events and reaction. If we only look at events, the best we can do is react. Something happens, and we fix it. This is typically our response the first time an event occurs. We do not shift our thinking in any way. We just act swiftly to fix the immediate problem using pre-existing solutions that have worked in the past. For some superficial events, this approach can work well, but will clearly fail if an issue is more systemic, as we are merely dealing with the symptoms of the problem. Pattern and anticipation. When we start to notice a pattern of those events, we have more options. We can anticipate what is going to happen, and we can plan for it. When we start noticing patterns, we can begin to consider what is causing the same events to happen over and over again. Structure and design. When we start to look at the underlying structures, we begin to see where we can change what is happening. We are no longer at the mercy of the system. We can begin to identify the thinking and the mental models that are resulting in those structures taking the form they do. Mental model and transform. Changing the model that an organization uses is the highest leverage point. It can lead to real transformation, with the possibility to totally restructure the system and overcome even the greatest of challenges. It is possible that events can change behavior, which changes elements, which change relations, function, and models, but it is not often. A billion events may pass without altering the system much. In contrast, if you go the other direction and change the paradigm and function of the system, you will almost certainly get major changes. A paradigm shift is when things move on that level, but of course, those things happen very rarely. For example, the last time Western society had a major cultural paradigm shift was approximately 500 years ago as we entered the modern era. This really did change almost every aspect of these societies. It created a new body of knowledge with the scientific revolution, a new system of political organization with the Enlightenment, French Revolution, and the rise of the modern republic nation-state, a new technology base with the Industrial Revolution, a new economic organizational paradigm with capitalism, a new way of structuring organizations with the bureaucracy. All of that followed naturally from a shift in the underlying cultural paradigm from one grounded in the spirituality of the Middle Ages to a materialistic scientific paradigm of the modern era. J. W. Forrester described complex systems as being counterintuitive. Leverage points are likewise not intuitive, or if they are, we intuitively use them backward, systematically worsening whatever problems we are trying to solve. For example, if we were to take a political system and look for the leverage point, we would likely look to the top of the hierarchy, thinking that if we could just change what the leader is doing, then this would affect everyone else. But of course, the leader is just an actor in the system who is responding to events. A politician with 4 years in office will spend most of their time putting out fires and catering to the interest of those who voted for them so as to get reelected. Where this analysis fails is that it looks for the leverage points all on one level, the event level. But just like the iceberg model, the leverage points are an abstraction. You have to remove the successive layers of detail before you will get to the fundamentals where the leverage really is. Looking for leverage points on the event level will lead you astray. Our non-systematic ways of thinking lead us to focus on low leverage changes. We focus on symptoms where the stress is greatest, trying to accumulate a large number of resources or get into positions of authority so as to remove or ameliorate the symptoms. However, leverage follows the principle of economy of means, where the best results come not from large-scale efforts, but from small, well-focused actions. Orit Gal suggests the idea of social acupuncture, which explores how analyzing the deeper interactions sustaining patterns can be used to identify leverage points, and how small, accumulative interventions across such points can be used to disrupt and transform them. Real systems change comes from a change in quality. The high leverage points are really in the qualitative factors of the system. They are the things that are not being measured or accounted for, and thus they go largely unnoticed. A reductionist analytical approach has led our cultures to place an overemphasis on quantity and numbers, has given us the idea that what we can measure is more important than what we can't measure. In a system's normal state of operations, it may well be that quantity matters most because it is in a linear regime. But it is quality that creates change. Nonlinear change is a qualitative change. It is the one person who acts qualitatively differently by standing up and saying, "No, I will not take a bribe." If you look at major changes, like the fall of the British Empire in India, that was accelerated by a person that acted qualitatively differently to the way most people do. As Donella Meadows writes, before you disturb the system in any way, watch how it behaves. If it's a piece of music, or a whitewater rapid, or a fluctuation in a commodity price, study its beat. If it's a social system, watch it work, learn its history. We love the idea of the genius creator. They change history, they rewrite the rules. However, the idea that we create something new is a bit of an illusion. Innovation is really about taking the resources we are given from the past and remixing them in some new way to create something that will be of relevance to the present. There is a certain hubris in thinking that creativity or innovation comes from us. It is more productive to think that the capacity for change is not in us somewhere, but instead in the system we wish to change. Typically, the change is right in front of us. It is already happening. We just can't see it yet. If you want to change the system, you have to look at it and listen to it, because that is where the potential for change really is. Whereas creativity may come from within, innovation is more about the environment or context. For the new solution to be of value and become adopted, it has to be relevant to the world we live in. Many people created iPads before Apple had its success. The difference is that Apple just came at a time when the context was in place for that creation to be relevant to people's needs, and thus adopted and seen as innovative. We like the idea that innovation is new. In fact, innovation can be simply rediscovering what is already known, but making it relevant for the new context. The same is true for systems innovation. These complex adaptive systems have a massive amount of history. Innovation involves sometimes looking back at our old ways that prevailed before the current system became dominant, and reinventing those solutions in this new context. Everything you will ever do has probably been done before. However, it has not been done in this new context, and that is what will make it innovative and of value. To put it simply, innovation is about creating something that is relevant to the current context, and doing that requires a deep analysis of the current system you are dealing with, past and present. Vision and motivation are important, but just as important is realism, a deep appreciation for the complexity of the systems we live in. The unfortunate reality we have to face as systems innovators is that we are just tiny blips within vast, complex networks that shape the world around us. We need to appreciate that these systems that we are trying to effect change within are almost unimaginably vast, complex networks of adaptive nodes, making decisions locally according to the information they receive. It quite literally requires a huge stretch of our imagination to even begin to envision the reality of the systems we are operating in. All these overlapping and intersecting networks of connections, and everything we do will exist within that context. This is the reality of living in a 21st century high-tech, globally integrated economy. These systems that we are trying to change are often so large and complex that really you have almost no opportunity to actually change them. The idea that you can come in and define a desired outcome and impose it on the system is not realistic. We see it fail time and time again. A new government comes into office. There is a housing crisis or a health systems failure, so they are expected to draw up a plan for reform to take place while they are in office over the next 4 or 8 years. All changes are pushed throughout the system as promises are made. Unfortunately, this does not work because of the nature of the systems we are dealing with. The reason is these complex adaptive systems are much larger, much more complex than the people who want to change them, and they have a life of their own. There are a great many agents in the system that have local interests and will respond to the intervention in different ways, often simply resisting as the attempt for change grinds to a halt. Dr. Samir Rihani, co-author of Complexity and Public Policy, talks about this process in the English health systems as such. When you propose a large-scale change, the system is resilient, in the sense that not only does it accept change, which it does, and we know it has been accepting many changes, but on the other hand, it also tries to protect itself against, if you like, unusual changes, and it looks at these changes and says, hang on, I will need to wait and see whether in fact that's an appropriate change or not. And that is resilience. And that's why you have these large-scale changes that have little resilience in terms of continuity. They happen, and then 2 or 3 years later, there's another change that is brought about, and 2 or 3 years later, there's another change. In fact, it's been said that all these major NHS organizational changes have a half-life of about 2 or 3 years, and that's it. They are finished. This is exactly what we are trying to avoid because it is extremely costly. It takes precious time, energy, and money, and worst of all, it creates a sense that change is not possible, thus depleting morale. That is why the most important thing to learn is that you cannot change a complex adaptive system. All you can do is observe it, understand how it works, how it is changing over time, and work with that evolutionary potential. The social scientist Orit Gal illustrates this in her writing about the similarities between Chinese traditional thinking and contemporary complexity theories. Rather than trying to achieve an ideal end state, the role of strategy was to assess the many forces shaping a certain situation and detect configurations in this environment that could be favorable to the task at hand, or the general direction aimed towards. Within this mindset, the strategy is perceived in terms of seeking potential rather than a course of action, focusing on identifying existing emerging trajectories and how to best position oneself to take advantage of them. In this sense, it is those very circumstances that, for the Western strategist, come in the way of achieving her goal. That is the actual source of potential for the Chinese strategist. To be successful in systems change, you have to work with the evolutionary potential of the system, and your capacity to do that is fully based upon your capacity to understand where the system is coming from. What are the major processes of change currently underway? Where are they leading the system? And what is the potential within that to take the system to the next level? All of this we would term systems analysis. Systems analysis is a science and an art. It involves aspects of formal modeling, but just as importantly, it involves the skills of a good investigative journalist or an ethnographer. You want to follow things wherever they lead, drawing upon any and all relevant information like a good investigative journalist. Likewise, we want to get out of our own perspective of the system and into that of others, like a good ethnographer. Defy traditional disciplines and boundaries and expand thought horizons. As Donella Meadows writes, defy the disciplines, in spite of what you majored in, or what the textbooks say, or what you think you're an expert at. Follow a system wherever it leads. It will be sure to lead across traditional disciplinary lines. To understand that system, you will have to be able to learn from, while not being limited by, economists and chemists and psychologists and theologians. You will have to penetrate their jargons, integrate what they tell you, recognize what they can honestly see through their particular lenses, and discard the distortions that come from the narrowness and incompleteness of their lenses. They won't make it easy for you. A complex system that works is invariably found to have evolved from a simpler system that worked, as a complex system designed from scratch rarely works. As a consequence, all complex adaptive systems are shaped by their evolution and are a product of it. That the opportunities and possibilities going forward are a product of what happened to get to this point. Studying this history of the system helps to shift our understanding of it and the issues into one of dynamic change, rather than a static snapshot, moving our questioning from what's wrong to how did we get here, and where is the momentum to move forward. It also helps to move from a focus on the problem at hand to focus on the system behavior over time as the creator of the problems. As Donella Meadows writes, starting with history discourages the common and distracting tendency we all have to define a problem not by the system's actual behavior, but by the lack of our favorite solution. Virtually every problem we will encounter out there in the world can ultimately be traced back to a socio-cultural one. If you dig far enough into the water crisis, environmental degradation, inequality, or cybersecurity, you will find that it is not really about lack of water, lack of land, lack of money, or computer code as it may appear. It is really about people and how they see the world, how our thinking constrains us to a certain subset of solutions. All of these systems that we might be interested in changing are created by us and ultimately every problem can be traced back to the human condition. No matter how big and bad all these systems may appear, this is ultimately about us and how we choose to build our world. In this respect, one of the biggest mistakes we make is getting too focused on the technical dimension of a system and forgetting about people. We think that cybersecurity is all about code and computers, and we forget there are real people with interests and motives behind those computers. We think that transport is about cars and roads, when really it is a socio-technical system. We think that food is about farms, tractors, and produce, when really it is a socio-ecological system. Probably our biggest blind spot today is people. By adopting an analytical approach, we try to shift everything into the technical realm. We try to do away with the humans in the system, and we do this by moving them into the technical realm by assuming that they are rational. This blind spot creates a huge new space for innovation and potential for systems change. But as always, before we can use it, we have to understand the system we are dealing with, and this requires some form of stakeholder analysis, which simply means understanding the people in the system. We have to understand how the culture and social structure of an organization works to understand its potential for change. Assuming things about people is one of the most likely places we can stumble in our endeavors. As always, naivety does not help. Systems analysis is about a critical, detailed assessment of what exists, not about how we might like it to be. Assessing people and the motives in an objective light is sometimes the hardest thing to do. We are prone to have preconceptions that people are generally good or generally bad, with those preconceptions shaping our assumptions, which go unquestionably factored into our understanding of the system we are dealing with. But we need to try and get beyond this through a critical assessment. Stakeholder analysis is the process of mapping out the different individuals and organizations that have a stake of interest in a given project or system. This information is typically used to assess how the interests of those stakeholders should be addressed. Stakeholder mapping is the process of mapping out these various stakeholders through the use of some model. However, most of the traditional stakeholder analysis focuses on looking at the individual actors within the model and assuming a degree of rationality in their behavior. We assume that people make decisions in some way rationally and independently, which is often not the case. We typically think that it is the parts that create the system. We go into an organization and we look at the particularities of the members of the organization, and we think if they are good people, we will get good outcomes. When we hear about a politician or CEO involved in some scandal, we say, "What a terrible person." But what we often fail to see is the invisible set of incentive structures acting on those individuals. The basic premise in systems thinking is that systems dynamics create the behavior of the system. Donella Meadows puts it like this: that's the number one really important systems insight, is that systems behavior comes out of the system. Its interrelationships, its goals, not the elements, the people, the actors in it. The question is what is wrong with the system, not what is wrong with the people in it. In this context, this means that it is the incentive structures within the organization that creates the behavior of the members of that organization. This is a basic idea in game theory, that we study the structure of incentives that the actors are operating within as a game. In a general sense, we are trying to look where the forces and stresses are in the system. If we take a mechanical system, like a chair, we will see that it has a particular structure that is designed to channel and disperse a certain physical force that is placed on it. We can see how the gravitational forces exerted by someone sitting on it is channeled through the structure of the system. There are critical points where a lot of the force is being borne and other areas where there is none. The same is true for institutions. There are forces of incentives and responsibility. Some people are heroes, and they are the ones who defy the incentive structures placed on them. But most people are not. They will follow the course of least resistance. This was recognized long ago by the ancient Greek philosophers who looked around them and saw many different cultures. Those of the Spartans that were warlike and prayed to a certain set of gods, the different tribes with their customs, and the Athenians themselves that had their own beliefs and culture. What was of interest to them was that everyone seemed to conform with their own local culture. It was obvious from this that each person is not individually making a choice about the best god to believe in or the best cultural habits, but everyone is simply acting according to the local incentive structures acting on them. We may find the occasional person like Socrates that questions and challenges their culture, goes against the local incentives. These people are important, but they are rare. Many institutions over time come to do things that are very different from what they say they are doing. Russell Ackoff gives a number of examples saying that universities and colleges preach that their principal value and function is the education of students, and that's absolute nonsense. You can't explain the university's behavior if you think it's about education of students. What it's about is providing the faculty with the quality of work life they want. Teaching is the price they have got to pay, and like any price, you try to minimize it. A corporation says that its principal value is maximizing shareholder value. That is nonsense. If that were the case, executives wouldn't fly around on private jets and have Philippine mahogany-lined offices and the rest of it. The principal function of those executives is to provide themselves with the quality of work life that they like, and profit is simply a means which guarantees our ability to do it. So if we are going to talk about values, we've got to talk about what the values are in action, not in proclamation. Systems should be judged by their behavior and outcomes, not by rhetoric. People say what they are incentivized to say objectively. They do what they are incentivized to do subjectively. That is to say that we all find ourselves in roles as part of objective systems of organization, such as a bishop in the Catholic Church or a mayor of a city. In our interaction with others, we are incentivized to play that role. But when we are not interacting with others, we experience a different set of subjective incentives. Because our societies are populated by closed organizations, this creates the possibility for the gap between the two. Thus, with any closed organization, one has to understand the distinction between those two and how they shape the difference between what people say and what they will do. Donella Meadows states it clearly when she says, "Purposes are deduced from behavior, not from rhetoric or stated goals." Changing the incentives of agents is a hugely powerful leverage point, but what really matters are local subjective incentives, not necessarily global objective incentive systems. One has to keep in mind the difference between or one's interventions can easily become distorted, as captured in the term Cobra effect. The Cobra effect occurs when an attempted solution to a problem makes the problem worse because of perverse incentives. The term originated in an anecdote from the British Empire in colonial India. The British government was concerned about the number of dangerous cobra snakes in Delhi, so they offered a bounty for every dead cobra. Initially, this was a successful strategy as large numbers of snakes were destroyed for the reward. Eventually, however, enterprising people began to breed cobras for the income. When the government became aware of this, the reward program was scrapped, causing the cobra breeders to set the now worthless snakes free. As a result, the wild cobra population further increased. The apparent solution for the problem made the situation even worse due to a failure to trace through the consequences of the incentives that were being introduced. The Cobra effect illustrates why ethnography is so important in systems analysis. Ethnography is an approach where the researcher attempts to observe an organization or culture from the point of view of the subject of the study. Ethnographic studies help us to understand the system from the perspective of an individual acting within it. This helps us understand the subjective influences, experiences, and incentives that the individual is under locally, thus working to mitigate the mismatch between subjective and objective incentives structures. To do system innovation, we have to work with the relationships between the parts, and that starts by creating some kind of model for those linkages or connections. An ideal modeling method for this is system dynamics. Over the past several decades, system dynamics has proven to be a very effective and useful tool for mapping out the relationships and basic dynamics within complex organizations. There are plenty of resources on the subject out there, so we will only touch upon it here in giving a brief overview as to how it is of relevance to systems change. System dynamics is a branch of systems theory that tries to model and understand the dynamic behavior of complex systems as they change over time. The basic idea behind system dynamics is that of feedback loops that try to capture the interactions between the parts and how they lead to a certain overall pattern of behavior over time. Diagrams of the primary feedback loops in the system are often converted into computer simulations to model how changes in one part of the system may affect others and the overall pattern of development. System dynamics was created during the mid-1950s by Professor J. Forrester at MIT. He talked about the need for system dynamics because of the limitations in our normal modes of reasoning. It is my basic theme that the human mind is not adapted to interpreting how social systems behave. Our social systems belong to the class called multi-loop nonlinear feedback systems. In the long history of evolution, it has not been necessary for man to understand these systems until very recent historical times. Evolutionary processes have not given us the mental skill needed to properly interpret the dynamic behavior of the systems of which we have now become a part. In our more traditional ways of thinking, we often look at situations in terms of linear cause and effect. System dynamics helps us to look at and model the feedback loops through which an event may cause another event that then feeds back to create more or less of the same behavior. The basic idea is that of interdependence, that whatever you do does not disappear, but in fact has some effect in the greater system, which will over time feed back to affect the cause, with that feedback loop creating certain patterns over time. System dynamics uses what are called causal loop diagrams to do this. A causal loop diagram is a simple map of a system with all its constituent components and their interactions. By capturing interactions and consequently the feedback loops, a causal loop diagram helps to reveal the basic structure of the system. Feedback, in general, is the process in which changing one quantity changes the second variable, and the change in the second variable, in turn, changes the first. These feedback loops can be of two qualitatively different kinds, either positive or negative. A positive feedback loop means that values associated with the two nodes within the relation change in the same direction. So if the node in which the loop starts decreases, the value associated with the other node also decreases. Similarly, if the node in which the loop starts increases, the other node increases also. For example, the dynamics of the Earth's climate have many feedback loops that work to balance or change the system. One positive feedback loop driving climate change can be identified as such. When ice melts, land or open water takes its place. Both land and open water are on average less reflective than ice and thus absorb more solar radiation. This causes more warming, which in turn causes more melting, and this cycle continues. Another example here is the release of methane in permafrost, as warming is also the triggering variable for the release of carbon, potentially as methane, in the Arctic. Methane released from thawing permafrost, such as the frozen peat bogs in Siberia and on the sea floor, creates a positive feedback. Economics of scale is an example of a positive feedback loop between a business and its customers. The more products a company sells, the more revenue it receives from its customers, giving it more to invest in scaling up production, thus allowing it to reduce costs, which in turn means more customers will purchase the product, and so on. This is also called a virtuous cycle, where one party gains, the other does also. This also works in the opposite direction, giving us a vicious cycle, such as in a trade war, where one side imposing trade restrictions induces the other side to react with further tariffs. Of course, this cannot go on forever, and that is why positive feedback loops are typically associated with unstable processes that are likely to crash at some time. One thing to note here is how this language of feedback loops lets us look at and talk about nonlinear abrupt processes of change. If, for example, we think about most of our models for climate change, they are very much linear in nature, that if we reduce CO2 by a certain amount, we will reduce warming by a certain amount. This kind of model is obviously not accounting for tipping points and runaway positive feedback. Indeed, it is important to note that most of our formal and informal modeling about the future are based upon this kind of linear projection. If you look at future energy projections, models for the future usage of cars, for food demand, etc., they are generally based upon linear assumptions. Although sometimes they are accurate, those assumptions can also blind us to these nonlinear processes of change, giving us a false sense of security about the future. System dynamics may not give us exact predictions of what will happen, but what it can do is give an overall outline of the dynamics in the system and make us aware of where those points that would drive nonlinear exponential change may lay, and that is critically important when dealing with complexity. Our best laid plans can go out the window because we have not thought about the possibility of a financial crisis, that paradigm shift in technology, that collapse in an ecosystem's services, that political regime shift. Those things happen, but if you are not using nonlinear models, you will be blinded to them, and your best laid intentions will simply get overwritten by those broader processes of change. This happens time and time again, and it is another way in which we end up simply going round in circles. A negative causal link means that the two nodes change in opposite directions. If the node in which the link starts increases, then the other node decreases, and vice versa. Negative feedback is what works to hold the system in its current state, whereas positive feedback tends to lead to instability via exponential growth, oscillation, or chaotic behavior. Negative feedback generally promotes stability. The core supply and demand mechanism within a market is an example of negative feedback. When demand goes up, this creates more demand than supply, meaning producers can set higher prices, which then feeds back to affect consumers to purchase less, which then induces suppliers to reduce production. This feedback stays playing out until the system reaches some equilibrium, where supply and demand are matched, and the system will stay close to that until there is some change. Negative feedback is what makes systems sustainable because it means that the system is paying its own bills, so to speak. What is being gained from the action that you take is feeding back to be taken from you again. Like when you purchase an item, you get what you want, but the consequence of that is that you have to pay for it. For example, take the small town in northern France that was having such trouble with the rubbish being dumped in an unused public space outside the village. The culprits were many, but primarily the local building contracting companies that were trying to reduce costs by simply offloading their waste building materials into the public space. Although the local authorities knew who was to blame, the national laws restricted their capacity to deal with the issue. Disillusioned with waiting for the national policy to change, they eventually took the situation into their own hands by implementing a policy where locals could report those who dumped rubbish illegally. The local authorities would then collect the waste, track who it belonged to, and then go and dump it on their doorstep. This worked to solve the issue. We can understand the dynamics of what is going on here in terms of feedback loops. Firstly, there was a positive feedback loop that worked to let the system get out of hand. Every time someone dumped rubbish and was not prosecuted, this made it more acceptable for others to do likewise, as the rubbish built up over time. Then came the negative feedback loop where people who were dumping were reconnected with the cost of their actions by having it put inside their property, where they would have to suffer the consequences of it instead of that being borne by others in the common space. The underlying dynamic here is one of negative externalities. Positive feedback is always unsustainable because it is drawing in resources to fuel itself from somewhere external to the system. This will, however, only last for a brief period of time, and then it will be over. The solution to negative externalities and unsustainability is to close the positive feedback loop and convert it into a negative loop, which makes the system self-sustaining. As this is a key part to developing sustainable solutions, we will talk further about it in a coming module. To perform a more detailed quantitative analysis, a causal loop diagram is transformed to a stock and flow diagram, which helps in studying and analyzing the system in a quantitative way, typically through the use of computer simulations. A stock is a term for any entity that accumulates or depletes over time. A flow, in contrary, is the rate of change in a stock. So an example of a stock might be a water reservoir. It is a store of water, and we can ascribe a value to the volume it contains. Now, if we put an outlet on the side of our reservoir and started pouring water out of it, this would be an example of a flow. Whereas a stock variable is a measure of some quantity, a flow variable is measured over an interval of time. By using these tools of system dynamics, we may get a qualitative and/or quantitative idea of how a system of interest is likely to develop over time. For example, if we create a simple two-dimensional graph with time on the horizontal axis, we will see how the different feedback loops create different types of graphs. Graphs for positive feedback loops typically reveal an initial exponential growth as they shoot upwards rapidly, but then reach some environmental boundary condition where they crash back down again. A financial bubble and ensuing crash could be an example of this. Whereas the net result of a negative feedback loop will be a wave-like graph that will likely be bounded within an upper and lower limit over a prolonged period of time, with relatively smooth fluctuations during the system's development that enable it to sustain an overall stable state in the long term. System dynamics not only helps us to understand the dynamics driving the behavior of the system, but this also gives us insight into where to best intervene in the system. It helps to identify leverage points. Identifying positive and negative feedback within a system is critical to systems analysis because it tells you about the system's potential for change. In general, complex systems do not change when there is a lot of negative feedback. The only chance for systems change is when there is a large amount of positive feedback. It is this period of exponential change driven by positive feedback that we can call phase transitions, and we will pick this topic up again in the next section. The only time we really get to do large-scale system change is when a system is in transition. When a system is in its normal state, one's capacity to alter the whole organization will be close to zero. As long as an organization is in or near its normal state of operation, it will strongly resist systemic change. If there is no sign of crisis in the system, you will not be able to alter it on a systemic level. The great management systems thinker Russell Ackoff once pointed out quite clearly how you get a large-scale system to change. The easiest conditions under which to convince any organization to change is when it's in the state of crisis, when its stability or survival is threatened. If it's desperate enough, it's willing to change in ways that it would never otherwise consider, and therefore one of the important techniques that are available is to show any organization, no matter how successful it is, that in its current future there is a crisis impending. The way that's done is you assume that the organization will continue to do what it's doing now indefinitely into the future, and you assume the organization's environment will change, but only in ways that it expects. Now, if you project the future of the organization under those two conditions, you have a non-adaptive organization and a changing environment, and therefore will ultimately, through non-adaptation, destroy itself. The projection reveals the Achilles heel of the organization. Your only chance for affecting systems change in a large-scale complex system is when the current paradigm is no longer working. Not only this, but the system will have already had to have faced a number of critical issues that the old model has manifestly been proven incapable of solving before the mainstream of the organization will be ready for any form of major transformation. Think, for example, about the environmental movement just 40 or 50 years ago. A lot of effort was put in by environmentalists, but very little happened. It is only now that an environmental crisis is apparent, and the limitations of current solutions in the face of that are apparent, that there is the possibility for systems change. Of course, the time to solve the environmental crisis was 30 or 40 years ago. Now it is too late to solve those issues within the existing model. A transition implies that you are not going back to the old model. It is too late at that stage. As discussed before with complex systems, you never really get to redesign some new system. System change is really about enabling transitions within an organization. A transition is a process or a period of change from one condition to another. Transitions are pervasive in nature. Many different types of systems undergo rapid change before emerging in a new form or state of semi-stability on the other side. Children become adults, seeds become plants, a town becomes a metropolis. But the classic example of a transition is the metamorphosis of a caterpillar into a butterfly. The reason that the terms systems innovation and systems change have risen to prominence today is due to fundamental transformations taking place in the global economy. These transformations are the drivers of change, and it is really only by harnessing them that we can really hope to change anything on a fundamental level. Transitions are different from normal periods of change. During normal periods of change, the whole structure of the organization stays the same, while the parts change. Things typically grow or decay in an incremental fashion as one thing builds on top of another. Stable existing structures provide the context within which the parts change, with this change happening in a proportional fashion where only big events cause big changes, with small events only able to cause small changes. Transitions are different from normal linear processes of change, where there is only a change in the individual parts. With phase transitions, new macro-level structures emerge. For example, as ice goes through a phase transition to become water, the overall structure of the substance changes without any of the individual atoms or molecules being changed. During a transition, the parts may stay largely unchanged, but the context around them changes fundamentally. We can call this overarching context a paradigm. Typically, two overall patterns are mutually exclusive. When we flip a coin, we either get a head or a tail, not somewhere in between. Two people can exchange a song if they both use analog or both use digital, but the two overall patterns are mutually exclusive. They both have to use the same pattern to enable the exchange. This is why paradigm shifts happen very rarely and happen fast, because there are huge dislocations and inefficiencies created by having two fundamentally different patterns in the system, and because there are huge advantages gained by everyone using the same basic pattern. The system will thus strongly resist staying in that transition process, and once it finds the new pattern, move rapidly into it, fueled by network effects. Major systems change comes about as a function of a qualitative change in the system, not a quantitative change. Qualitative change is a systems level change because it is not about the system doing what it does better, fast, or more efficiently. It is about the system doing something different. It is a change in the context within which the system exists, a change in the understanding of the end objective of the system and the function it performs, and as a consequence, the enabling structures and organizations required to enable that function. Think about an auto company. Their model of the world was that people move around using their car and thus want cars. And if we build a better car, we will make customers happy and generate more revenue. So the system is set up to make an incremental improvement in the properties of their cars and try to sell more. A paradigm shift here would involve a reassessment of what the organization is trying to achieve. We might say this is not about cars, it is about mobility. Mobility is delivered by transport systems. How can we build a better transport system? That is a very different question. A very different kind of organization with different objectives would follow from it. Or think about an energy company. Previously, their objective was to extract more fuel to satisfy customer demand and generate revenue. But given the current realization to the negative environmental consequence of this and the shift towards energy conservation, the organization might move to see itself as a provider of energy as a service via a smart grid network. The smart grid is here a paradigm shift. They are no longer trying to extract more energy, but instead coordinating the exchange of energy. The system they build to do that would be qualitatively different from the one that was designed to extract fuels from the ground. If a system is not in crisis, then it is not going through a systemic transformation. A crisis is one dimension to a systemic transformation. A systemic transformation implies that the system cannot go on doing what it did in the past. This is exhibited as a form of unsustainability. In a transition, the system cannot go on operating as it did in the past, and likewise it cannot stay where it is because it is consuming too many resources. It has to and will change. The only question is, will it degrade to a lower level or integrate to a higher level? That is the only thing that is really relevant. Thinking about going back, staying where you are, or envisioning a future that looks similar to the present is no longer relevant. By definition, a transition implies that the system will change and the future state will not be similar to the past. We will pick up on this theme in the next section as we talk about attractors and bifurcations. Complexity theory has taught us that there are universal patterns for how complex, nonlinear organizations change over time. This process of change is the same for any complex system. for ecosystems, for change in technology, for changes in culture, economy, or society, or large enterprises. The general model is based around feedback loops, attractors, bifurcations, phase transitions, self-organization, and emergence. By understanding this process, we can better use it towards enabling organizational change. As discussed previously, feedback loops within a system are central to understanding its dynamic behavior over time. Negative feedback works to dampen down change, while positive feedback works to drive exponential change. When a system is in strong negative feedback regime, it will be very difficult, if not impossible, to change it. The resilience and capacity of a system to resist change is largely a function of its networks of negative feedback that balance and stabilize it. This normal state to a system behavior is what we call an attractor, which is a set of states towards which the system will naturally gravitate, as these balancing feedback forces work to constantly pull it back to its normal state of operations. For example, the fact that most adults have to work so as to support themselves creates a certain pattern in their behavior over the course of a week. Most adults have a work and leisure pattern. We work only so long, and then we relax. Once relaxed, we are ready for work again the next day. We can't go on relaxing for too long because we have to pay the bills for it. This creates a balancing loop that pulls us back to that dynamical pattern of behavior that follows a regular set of states. This is an attractor created by negative feedback. Change happens when these negative feedback loops become eroded, and positive feedback starts to become more prevalent. Every time a negative feedback loop is broken, this reduces the strength of the forces influencing the elements to remain within that pattern, and make it more likely that some will stray off into other patterns of organization. If we look around us, we will see that most systems are in a normal state of development. Quite rarely do we see exponential change. Systems have long, relatively stable periods before they go through phase transitions that involve positive feedback and exponential change. These happen relatively fast. Exponential change cannot last long. A transition implies that the system will not stay in its current form. The transition will take it into a new way of operating. Transitions do not last longer than a short period of time because they consume large amounts of energy. Typically, systems cannot go on consuming that much energy for long. During a transition, the global structures or basin of attraction that supported the system previously disintegrate and new attractors emerge. The system can, of course, take many different trajectories in the future, but on a generalized level, those trajectories can be seen to occupy one of two different general regimes. The system either disintegrates to a lower level of organization and functionality, or integrating to a higher level of coordination. The challenge is to find the potential within the system for it to self-organize into that desired higher level of functionality. Making the transition is really about building that new attractor so that it is easier for people to move into it, so that the cost-benefit equation makes sense before the system really reaches a crisis and collapses. As always, with these complex organizations, you cannot simply create a new pattern. The new pattern or attractor does not come from nowhere. It is created out of latent potential within the existing system. Potential is always latent. That is to say, by definition, potential is hidden. Look at a forest, and we will see lots of trees. And we will think that is all there is to the forest. But those trees are already largely dead. The future potential of the system is hidden in the seeds underground. This will be the same for social systems change. The new potential in the system will be out on the fringes, hidden from sight, and difficult to find. As systems innovators, our job is to find those seeds, to try to understand which ones have real potential, and to nurture them. In reality, this is all we can do when dealing with very complex organizations. Work with the evolutionary potential in the system. Because transitions are systemic, and there is a strong drive towards there only being one systemic pattern, transitions involve the disintegration of the existing model, which creates an unsustainable situation and the creation of a new model that draws people through a vision of the creation of a higher level of organization, the disintegration of one basin of attraction and the creation of another. Orit Gal talks about this when she identifies two drivers of systems change. Firstly, when there is unsustainable tension, the fact that people can see things colliding in a destructive fashion that will lead to some form of systems crash. One good example of this might be the water-food-energy nexus. Those three form an interconnected system, but each of them is in some form of crisis. The second is convergence of constructive trends that lead to the creation of a new context, which makes possible new things. The system takes on a new coherence. Globalization might be an example of this. Information technologies have made possible global coordination at the speed of light. This creates a new set of connections, a new context wherein new forms of organization can emerge. Paul Raskin, who writes about the Great Transition, also talks about this in a similar fashion. Sustainability is kind of the necessity that pushes a great transition, while a vision of a better life is a magnet that pulls it forward. But to get there, the curve of development has to be bent twice. A radical revision of technological means can begin the transition, but a reconsideration of human ends is needed to complete it. Nonlinear processes of change are characterized by what are called bifurcations. A bifurcation is when something divides into two branches or parts. In this case, it is a divide between the old structures and the new ones that emerge. This involves the splitting off of the system into two or more qualitatively different trajectories of development. When an organization is in a normal state, there will be one dominant basin of attraction represented by a very strong and large mainstream at the center of the organization, and a relatively small fringe that has little direct impact on the mainstream. This is the world that developed economies lived in maybe 50 or 60 years ago, where hierarchies were accepted as the dominant mode for organizing society, and networks were seen as marginal. When there was a large and stable middle class in developed economies, and things like organic farming and environmentalism were alternative, having little effect on the mainstream. When the system enters into a transition, another basin of attraction forms, and the system is split between two different modes of operation. This is the world we live in today, where networks have risen to rival hierarchies, where the middle class in advanced economies has retreated, and a bipolar world of very rich and poor has emerged, where alternatives to the mainstream like organic food and alternative technologies like solar and wind sit alongside traditional solutions. This is a bistable system with two basins of attraction, but it won't stay like this for long. Because of the fundamental issues of interoperability, there are strong forces pushing the system to adopt one single pattern on the macro level that makes this bistable period very transitory. This is like a political revolution. Everyone wants the revolution to come to an end so as to reinstall a single global structure that is required to achieve normal functionality within the system. If it does not do that within some period of time, it may well destroy itself. The organization will stay iterating and evolve rapidly as these two worlds diverge, and we end up predominantly in one or the other. Either the elements will self-organize with the emergence of global coherence and a new level of organization, or it will collapse to a lower level of functionality. Organizations ultimately collapse when they can no longer respond to changing environmental conditions successfully. When the environment becomes too dynamic and complex, and the internal structure of the organization too inert to respond to that change. A primary cause of organizational collapse is the tragedy of the commons. In all organizations, the institutional infrastructure has to connect the cost and benefit of individual action with the cost and benefit to the whole organization. A failure to do this results in accumulating negative externalities, depleting the resources of the whole, and leading to unsustainable processes. An overly complicated system leads to fracturing and compartmentalization, which enables negative externalities and the disintegration of the overall organization. During a transition, the centralized structures that supported the system in the previous regime become no longer functional. They can no longer be depended upon to deliver the required solutions to problems that extend beyond their level of structural complexity. In the face of such problems, they appear at best paralyzed. In order for the system to maintain its level of functionality or evolve into a new form, new functional structures have to emerge out of the distributed parts. Previously latent functions and capabilities become revealed and become critical to the organization's future success. This is unlike during normal periods when it is manifest capabilities that are valued. Due to this increased importance of the latent distributed capabilities in the organization, the history of the organization becomes ever more important. It is the choices the organization made in the past that brought it to this current state that really comes to matter. Without dependence upon the legacy centralized organizations, new capabilities have to emerge out of distributed, self-organizing processes. As standard centralized structures become increasingly discredited within the mainstream, what were previously marginalized domains and capabilities are recognized as increasingly important. As large incumbent centralized organizations become inert, it stops being the dog that wags the tail and starts to be the tail that wags that dog. Fringe, informal, self-organizing networks emerge and have increasing influence in a turbulent world, marked by exponential change, surprising shocks, and extreme events that reveal the fragilities within the existing centralized systems. As the mass of members become discontented and disillusioned with the old institutional structures, more and more of the system's potential resources are left unutilized by the incumbent organizations, and this creates fertile ground for new forms of organization to emerge and grow rapidly. New connections are formed that once again offer the organization a sense of overall unity, direction, and potential that is significantly lacking in the existing institutions. These are times when small actions can have huge implications for the future trajectory of the system, and are thus critical points in systems change. The social scientist Immanuel Wallerstein talks about this process as such. When a system, any kind of system, enters a moment of bifurcation and is, therefore, coming to an end, two things happen. The structure becomes chaotic, and secondly, it becomes one in which small input gets great output, as opposed to a normally functioning system in which great input gets great output. This is very important to remember because that means we are in a chaotic, confused situation in which there is going to be real struggle about the new order, unlike 50 or 100 years ago when we worked very hard and organizations worked very hard and didn't get very far. The revolutions didn't turn out to be so revolutionary. Now every little input will get very great output. Every little touch by us in the next 20 to 50 years is going to have a big impact, and it may not be the impact that we want if we touch it in the wrong way. As we have previously discussed, if you want to enable change within large systems, you have to learn how to work with the system's innate propensity for change. If we want to enable real, large-scale systems to change, we are going to have to tap into and work with deep structural transformations that are taking place in our world today. Probably the deepest and most profound of these transformations is the move into the so-called information age. The advent of information technology, some 60 to 70 years ago, marked a long process of change, taking us into an age of information. This information revolution is a major systemic transformation in the economy, similar to that of the rise of agriculture or industrialization, with similar all-encompassing implications. Today, an extraordinary technological revolution is underway at high speed. Society and economies are being drawn along by constant changes in information technology that are having an ever larger impact on the socio-economic fabric. While most organizations are still trying to catch up with innovations that happened 10 years ago, even more powerful technologies are still yet to be unleashed, as tech-driven disruption has become the new norm. Although for most people, information technology is the driver of change in our world, as systems innovators, it is more constructive to see information technology as simply a tool for implementing a new design paradigm. Historically, the development of systems theory and computer technology happened in tandem, and are in many ways two sides of the same coin. Both systems thinking and computer technology are about organization. Whereas one deals with it on a conceptual level, the other deals with it on the level of information. Information on a very fundamental level is about organization, and information technology is really a technology of organization. It enables us to fundamentally create new structures and forms of organization that were previously not possible due to physical constraints. The information revolution works to change our systems of organization from being based around physical constraints to being based upon information. Traditionally, we have organized our world around the constraints of physicality. Culture is based upon our geography. Political organization is based around the limitations of space and territoriality. Work happens in offices and factories. Education is done within the walls of schools, etc. Shifting these systems from being based around their physical constraints to being based around information offers huge potential for systems-level innovation and structural redesign. As a person once famously said, in the future, every company will be a technology company. Every organization will go through a process of reconceptualizing itself as being fundamentally not about its physical form, but instead start to understand itself in terms of information. For example, the most physical of industrial-age companies like General Electric now call themselves a digital industrial company, making digital twins for each of their products that go into production. Or take, for example, baseball. Baseball, you would think, is certainly a very physical activity. How could we ever understand it as being about information? But listen to Houston Astros general manager Jeff Luhnow when he says, "Big data combined with artificial intelligence is the next big wave in baseball. We are making a big investment in this area. I think other clubs are also. We know what every person is doing on the field at all times. We know what the bat and ball are doing on the field at all times. We now have information we didn't dream we would have a few years back. Developing models from all that information is going to be critical to the success of teams going forward." Information is all about organization. The shift from the physical world to the information world marks a shift in our understanding of systems, technology, and enterprises. From thinking of them in terms of their physical attributes to thinking of them in terms of organization. It used to be all about the building blocks. Now it is about how you put those building blocks together, how you organize parts into systems. The making of building blocks becomes a commodity, and the value shifts to information, which is used for the coordination and organization of those components. The largest taxi company owns no cars. The largest media companies produce no media content. The largest temporary accommodation service owns no rooms. What they do is organize things through information. To make this transition to a sustainable world, we have to radically dematerialize our economies. And that starts with shifting our mentality to thinking information and ideas first, and matter as simply the means with which to implement that. We create generic solutions on the information level, where it can be easily and costlessly designed, prototyped, exchanged, and duplicated. Then, when necessary, we create a concrete instantiation of that. Systems are not things. They are the invisible connections and interactions between those things. Thus, if you want to change systems, you are designing organizations, and that is done via information networks. If you are doing systems innovation, you have to forget about the things. What we are trying to do is reorganize the system, and that reorganization takes the form of information. Donella Meadows gives the example of how in 1986, new federal legislation in the USA required companies to report all chemical emissions from each of their plants. Through the Freedom of Information Act, this information becomes a matter of public record. In July 1988, the first data on chemical emissions became available. The reported emissions were not illegal, but they didn't look very good when they were published in local papers by enterprising reporters, who had a tendency to make lists of the top 10 local polluters. That's all that happened. There were no lawsuits, no required reductions, no fines, no penalties. But within 2 years, Chemical emissions nationwide were reported to have decreased by 40%. Some companies were launching policies to bring their emissions down by 90%, just because of the release of previously stored information. Information and ideas are powerful tools. If you are not using them, then you will not be able to move whole systems. You will just be pushing parts around. So in systems innovation, when it comes to actually building something, that starts with building an information system first. This is important because our traditional reasoning and assumptions will lead us in the opposite direction. That food systems are about farms, tractors, and vegetables. That healthcare is about doctors and hospitals. That transport is about cars, roads, and fuel. If you are doing systems innovation, it is not really about any of those things. Healthcare, food, transport, finance, etc. It is all first and foremost about organization and information. The form that organization takes, and your job as a systems innovator, is to change the system structured by changing the flow of information. The required physical changes will follow from that. We all get attached to things, and that is fine if you just want to do normal old innovation with incremental change. But if you want to do systems innovation, if you want to change the paradigm, you are only going to be able to do that by letting go of all those things and looking at the organization as a whole, reshaping it through building new information systems, new ways that information is recorded, what is recorded, how it is represented, how it flows, who gets what information, etc. These are the things that change how systems behave. Whereas organizations based around physicality create boundaries and centralized systems, organizations based on information are about connections and thus take a networked structure. With the rise of information technology, the proliferation of connectivity and networks has been rapid and pervasive, as it increasingly affects all areas of the economy. This revolution in information has many profound consequences, but possibly the most important is the shift that it enables from closed, centralized systems of organization to open, networked organizations. As the American management expert Gary Hamel puts it, for thousands of years, markets and hierarchies were the only alternatives when it came to aggregating human effort. Now there's a third option: real-time distributed networks. Industrial-age systems of organization selectively favored the concentration of resources, capabilities, and intelligence within closed, centralized systems, where economies of scale could be leveraged to achieve high productivity, efficiencies in throughput, and profitable returns on investment. This involved the development of large, formal, relatively static, and often resource-demanding systems of organization with well-defined boundaries that then pushed out products to relatively passive end users. This is the model we inherit today for virtually all forms of production and service provisioning, from governance to education to manufacturing to energy and agriculture. But heightened connectivity is breaking down these boundaries to our organizations, connecting people directly peer-to-peer as power shifts fundamentally from the formal, closed, centralized organizations that form the backbone to our industrial economy to new forms of networked organizations enabled by information technology, as a whole new mode of production is emerging within society. Organizations are shifting from being defined by a set of formal fixed positions and fixed assets to becoming defined by connectivity, networks of connections that are enabled by online platforms. Information technology puts powerful tools of collaboration in the hands of many, which is enabling a radical reduction in transaction cost, with people now able to set up their own networks of collaboration, as informal, self-organizing systems have come to present an alternative to our traditional top-down model. This is working to enable the emergence of new forms of organization, where previously there was none. It is enabling a much higher level of coordination between people and technologies as they become networked into larger systems of organization. On the level of design and implementation, to do system innovation and change today means to take an organization that is currently closed and centralized and convert it into a distributed network. We can call these distributed networks platforms. To innovate in finance is to build a financial platform that connects people directly via an information network and automates the basic management of the network. To do systems change in energy is to build a smart grid platform, an information network that connects end users directly peer-to-peer and automates that exchange. To do system change in healthcare means building a health platform, a food network, a logistics network, an education network, etc. Systems change today means restructuring the basics of our organizations by building information-based networks that tap into the new potential of this global telecommunications network and analytical computational capacities of digital computers to coordinate human activities in new ways. This technology gives us the capacity to do redesign on a whole systems level across whole enterprises, industries, and sectors of the economy to realize systems change.